Welcome to our journey through the history of the USA, a country that has shaped the world like no other, politically, economically, culturally, and militarily. But before we begin, I have a question for you. What do you personally associate most strongly with the history of the United States? Is it the Declaration of Independence, the Wild West, the Civil War, the Civil Rights Movement, Hollywood, the American Dream, or maybe something else entirely? Write your answer in the comments below. I'm curious to see which events or images come to your mind first. In this script, we go step by step through the history of the USA, from the indigenous cultures of North America to the European colonies, the Revolution, slavery, the Civil War, the rise to world power, and the political and social challenges of the present. It's not just about dates and presidents. It's about big ideas, tough conflicts, and the question of how a country could come into being that still triggers enormous fascination today, but is also repeatedly critically discussed. If you are interested in such historical topics, feel free to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so that you don't miss the next chapters. And now we start with Chapter 1, Before Colonization, the Indigenous Cultures of North America. Chapter 1, Before Colonization, the Indigenous Cultures of North America. When talking about the history of the USA today, the narrative often begins with the arrival of European settlers, with the 13 colonies or with the Declaration of Independence of 1776. But this view falls far short of the mark. Long before European ships reached the coasts of North America, millions of people were already living there. They had their own languages, religions, trade routes, political systems, cities, villages, agriculture, art, and traditions. North America was not an empty continent that was only discovered by Europe. It was a diverse habitat with a long and rich history. The first humans reached the American continent many thousands of years ago. According to current research, their ancestors probably came from Asia and migrated to North America via a land connection in the area of today's Bering Strait. This land bridge existed during the Ice Age, when large amounts of water were trapped in glaciers and sea levels were significantly lower. From there, people spread across the entire continent. Over the millennia, they adapted to very different landscapes: the icy regions of the north, the forests of the east, the prairies of the center, the deserts of the southwest, the mountains of the west, and the fertile coasts of the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans. It is important to understand that the Indians never existed as a unified group. This term, which arose from an era of European explorers, obscures the enormous diversity of the indigenous peoples of North America. There were hundreds of different groups with their own names, languages, and ways of life. Some lived as hunter-gatherers, others practiced intensive agriculture. Some lived in small mobile groups, others in large settlements or even city-like centers. Their cultures were as different as European, African, or Asian cultures are among themselves. In the northeast of North America, for example, lived the Haudenosaunee, also known as the Iroquois League. This confederation originally consisted of several nations, including the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca. Later, the Tuscarora were added. Their political organization was particularly remarkable. The Haudenosaunee developed an alliance system based on consultation, joint decision-making, and a balance between nations. Several families often lived together in their longhouses, and women played an important role in many areas of society. They had an influence on property, kinship, and political decisions, for example in the selection of leaders. Further south, in the regions of what is now the southeastern United States, lived the Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminoles, among others. Many of these peoples farmed and grew corn, beans, and pumpkins. These three plants were often grown together and complemented each other particularly well. Corn served as the staple food, beans provided important nutrients and could grow up the corn stalks, while pumpkins covered the soil and stored moisture. This cultivation method shows how closely many indigenous communities observed and used their environment. In the Great Plains, the vast grasslands in central North America, other ways of life developed. Among others, the Lakota, Cheyenne, Comanche, Blackfeet, and many other peoples lived there. Often these groups are associated with horses and bison hunting. However, horses only came back to North America through the Europeans and later spread among many indigenous peoples. Previously, people hunted bison on foot and used sophisticated methods to drive the animals into groups. The bison was central to many communities. He supplied flesh, skins, bones, sinews, and horns. Almost every part of the animal was used. This use was not only practical, but often also spiritually embedded. Many indigenous societies did not see themselves as rulers of nature, but as part of a larger balance. In the Southwest, in the arid regions of present-day Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and Utah, cultures such as the Pueblo peoples, the Hopi, and the Zuni lived. They developed impressive settlements made of mud bricks and stone, often adapted to the climatic conditions of the region. Since water was scarce, irrigation, storage, and precise knowledge of the weather and seasons played a major role. Some settlements were located on rock faces or in protected areas, which gave them protection and stability. Here, too, agriculture was an important part of life, especially the cultivation of maize. On the northwest coast, in the area of present-day Alaska, British Columbia, Washington, and Oregon, people such as the Tlingit, Haida, Kwakwaka'wakw, and Chinook lived. This region was rich in natural resources, especially fish, seafood, and timber. People built large houses out of wood, made canoes, and created elaborate carvings. Totem poles are also known, but they were not simply idols, as European observers often misunderstood them, but could represent family histories, ancestry, social position, or important events. Societies on the northwest coast were often complexly organized, with clear social roles, trade relations, and ceremonial festivals. A particularly impressive example of the high development of indigenous societies is Cahokia. This city was located near present-day St. Louis in the state of Illinois, and was an important center of the so-called Mississippi culture between about 1050 and 1350. Cahokia had large mounds of earth, squares, living quarters, and probably tens of thousands of inhabitants. The largest mound, now known as Monk's Mound, is one of the largest prehistoric earthworks in North America. Cahokia clearly shows that there were large, organized, and influential societies in North America long before European colonization. Trade connected many of these communities over long distances. Shells from the coast, copper from the Great Lakes region, obsidian from volcanic areas, or special stones and feathers could be passed on over hundreds or even thousands of kilometers. These trade networks served not only to exchange goods, but also to exchange ideas, stories, technologies, and religious beliefs. North America was therefore not an isolated space of individual groups, but a continent full of connections. Spiritual ideas also played a central role in many indigenous cultures. The worlds of faith differed greatly from each other. Nevertheless, in many societies there was the idea that people, animals, plants, rivers, mountains, and celestial phenomena were interconnected. Rituals, stories, and ceremonies helped to maintain this relationship and strengthen one's own community. Knowledge was often passed on orally, through stories, songs, dances, and symbols. These oral traditions were no less important than written records. They preserved their origins, morals, natural knowledge, and historical experiences. When the first Europeans came to North America, they did not encounter an untouched wilderness, but an inhabited, designed, and culturally rich world. Many landscapes that Europeans later considered natural were already characterized by indigenous use. Forests were burned in a controlled manner to improve hunting areas or promote certain plants. Fields were planted, paths were used, rivers were navigated, and raw materials were mined. The indigenous peoples were active shapers of their environment. But the arrival of the Europeans was to change this world fundamentally. Diseases to which indigenous people had no immunity spread devastatingly. Violence, displacement, land grabbing, proselytizing, and broken treaties destroyed many communities or forced them to adapt. But it would be wrong to see indigenous peoples only as victims. They resisted, formed alliances, traded, negotiated, fought and preserved many of their traditions despite enormous pressure. This first chapter is therefore crucial for understanding the entire history of the United States. Because the history of America does not begin with Europe. It begins with the people who have lived on this continent for thousands of years. If you want to understand the USA, you also have to know these early cultures. They show us that even before colonization, North America was a place of great diversity, complex societies, and deep historical roots. The next chapter is about how European powers began to explore, claim, and colonize this continent, and how this opened a new, often violent epoch in American history. Chapter 2: European Discovery and Colonization. When European seafarers began to cross the Atlantic in the late 15th century, the history of North America changed fundamentally. From a European point of view, the Age of Discoveries now began. But this term is problematic, because North America was not uninhabited and did not have to be discovered first. Millions of indigenous people have lived on the continent for thousands of years. For them, the arrival of the Europeans did not mean a new beginning, but the beginning of a time full of upheavals, dangers, and violent changes. The European expeditions arose for several reasons. On the one hand, countries such as Spain, Portugal, France, England, and the Netherlands were looking for new trade routes to Asia. Spices, silk, precious metals, and other valuable goods were in demand in Europe. However, the overland route to Asia was long, expensive, and politically uncertain. Therefore, seafarers tried to find new routes across the sea. On the other hand, power, fame, and religion played a major role. European rulers wanted to expand their influence, claim new territories, and spread Christianity. Economic interests, political competition, and religious zeal combined to form a powerful driving force. A decisive moment was the voyage of Christopher Columbus in 1492. Columbus sailed west on behalf of the Spanish crown to find a sea route to Asia. Instead, he reached islands in the Caribbean. Although he never set foot in what is now the United States, his journey had enormous consequences. It opened the way for permanent European expansion in America. Spain became the first major colonial power in the so-called New World. The Spaniards conquered large parts of Central and South America, destroyed powerful empires such as the Aztecs and Incas, and established a huge colonial empire. Spain also left its mark early on in the area of what is now the south and southwest of the USA. Spanish expeditions explored Florida, the Southwest, and parts of present-day California. Juan Ponce de Leon reached Florida in 1513. Later, Hernando de Soto moved through areas in southeastern North America. Francisco Vázquez de Coronado explored parts of what is now Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, Oklahoma, and Kansas in the 1540s. These expeditions were often brutal. They searched for gold, fame, and new dominions, but encountered indigenous communities that did not simply submit. The Spaniards also founded early settlements and mission stations. One of the oldest permanently existing European settlements in the territory of today's USA is St. Augustine in Florida, founded in 1565. Especially in the Southwest and later in California, mission chains emerged. These missions were religious, economic, and political institutions at the same time. For many indigenous people, they meant forced labor, cultural oppression, and the loss of traditional ways of life. While Spain was mainly active in the South, Southwest, and the Caribbean, France focused more on the North and the interior. French explorers, traders, and missionaries moved along large rivers and lakes. In particular, the St. Lawrence River, the Great Lakes, and later the Mississippi became important routes of French expansion. In 1608, Samuel de Champlain founded Quebec, which became the center of New France. From there, the French built up an extensive network of trading posts, alliances, and mission stations. In contrast to the English, the French initially founded less large settlement colonies with many European families. Their focus was more on the fur trade, especially with beaver skins, which were in great demand in Europe. To do this, they were dependent on cooperation with indigenous peoples. French traders formed alliances, sometimes marrying into indigenous communities and adopting knowledge of the landscape, language, and trade routes. However, this does not mean that French colonization was peaceful or equal. It was also part of a European power project that influenced, changed, and brought indigenous societies into colonial dependencies. The Dutch also played an important role, especially in the 17th century. They founded the colony of New Netherlands on the east coast of North America. Its center was New Amsterdam, which later became New York. The Dutch were mainly interested in trade. The location at the mouth of the Hudson River was strategic because it provided access to the interior. New Amsterdam developed into a diverse trading center where people of different origins lived. But Dutch rule did not last permanently. In 1664, the English took over the colony and renamed New Amsterdam, New York. England eventually became the decisive colonial power on the Atlantic coast of North America. The English colonies developed from the early 17th century onwards. An early attempt was the colony of Roanoke in the 1580s, but it failed and is still known today as the Lost Colony. Jamestown, founded in Virginia in 1607, was more successful. Jamestown was the first permanent English settlement in North America. The early years were extremely difficult. Hunger, disease, conflicts with indigenous peoples, and a lack of experience led to the death of many settlers. Virginia's economic success was soon closely linked to tobacco cultivation. Tobacco became popular in Europe and brought high profits. But the cultivation was labor-intensive. Initially, English colonists often relied on contract workers from Europe, so-called indentured servants. These people committed themselves to working for several years to pay for their passage to America. Later, however, African slave labor increasingly became the basis of the plantation economy. This was the beginning of a development that was to have a profound impact on the history of the United States. Another important moment was the arrival of the Pilgrim Fathers in 1620. They landed in New England with the Mayflower and founded Plymouth. Many of them were religious separatists who had experienced persecution or restrictions in England. They wanted to build a community according to their own religious ideas. Later, a larger Puritan colony was established in Massachusetts. The Puritans often saw themselves as a chosen community to live a godly life. At the same time, they were often intolerant of dissenters. Religious freedom therefore usually applied only to one's own group, not necessarily to everyone. European colonization had dramatic consequences for indigenous peoples. One of the most devastating effects was disease. Smallpox, measles, influenza, and other infectious diseases brought by Europeans spread among indigenous populations. Since they had no immunity to it, large parts of the population died in some regions. These epidemics massively weakened communities, often even before they had direct contact with Europeans. As a result, power relations, trade relations, and political structures shifted. In addition to diseases, hunger for land and different ideas of ownership led to conflicts. Many European settlers viewed land as property that could be bought, sold, and owned permanently. Many indigenous societies, on the other hand, had different ideas about use, responsibility, and communal rights. Although there were also complex rights of ownership and use among indigenous peoples, they did not correspond to the European model. Misunderstandings, deliberate deception, and power imbalances led to indigenous communities losing more and more land. At the same time, relations were not only marked by war. There was trade, diplomacy, alliances, and mutual dependencies. In the first decades, European colonists were often dependent on indigenous help. They learned from them which crops could be grown, how to move in the landscape, and how to survive. Indigenous groups, on the other hand, used European goods such as metal tools, weapons, fabrics, or glass beads for their own interests. But these contacts changed existing power relations and were able to create new dependencies. The competition between the European powers also made North America a scene of global rivalry. Spain, France, England, and the Netherlands claimed territories, established bases, and tried to control trade routes. Often, indigenous nations were drawn into these conflicts or used them strategically, forming alliances with one European power against another. As a result, North America was part of a global power struggle early on. By the end of the 17th century, the European presence had established itself on many coasts and rivers in North America. But colonization was not a uniform process. It varied depending on the region. Spain established missions and military posts. France focused heavily on trade and alliances in the interior. The Dutch created trading centers, and England developed settlement colonies that grew strongly over time. Especially these English colonies on the Atlantic coast were later to form the basis for the United States. This chapter shows that the emergence of America did not begin with a single event, but with many encounters, interests, and conflicts. European expansion brought new goods, new religions, and new political systems to North America. At the same time, it brought violence, disease, exploitation, and the displacement of indigenous peoples. From these contradictory beginnings, the colonial world slowly developed, from which the 13 British colonies later emerged. In the next chapter, we will look at precisely these 13 colonies, their differences, their economies, their societies, and the question of why, despite all their differences, they later stood together against Britain. Chapter 3: The 13 Colonies. The history of what would later become the United States does not begin as a history of a unified country. Before the USA existed, 13 British colonies existed on the Atlantic coast of North America, which developed over a long period of time. They were located between present-day Maine in the north and Georgia in the south. Although they were all under British rule, they were very different from each other. Climate, economy, religion, society, and political culture differed depending on the region. It is precisely these differences that are important in order to understand why these colonies were later able to emerge into a common state, and why the state was marked by tensions from the beginning. The 13 colonies can be roughly divided into 3 regions: New England in the north, the Middle Colonies, and the Southern Colonies. New England included Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. The Middle Colonies consisted of New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. To the south were Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. This classification helps to better understand the different lifestyles and interests of the colonists. New England was characterized by a cool climate, stony soils, and long winters. Large plantations like in the South were hardly possible there. Instead, many people lived from smaller farms, fishing, shipbuilding, trade, and crafts. The proximity to the Atlantic Ocean played a decisive role. Ports like Boston became important centers of trade. Ships transported goods between the colonies, the Caribbean, Africa, and Europe. New England was thus economically more oriented towards trade, seafaring, and small-scale agriculture. New England also had a special religious character. Many early settlers were Puritans who wanted to build a society according to their religious ideas. They believed that their community should be a role model for others. Religion was closely linked to politics and everyday life. Church attendance, moral rules, and communal control played a major role. At the same time, this did not automatically mean religious tolerance. Anyone who deviated from the prevailing ideas could be persecuted or excluded. People like Roger Williams or Anne Hutchinson came into conflict with the Puritan authorities because of their religious views. Rhode Island later emerged as a place of greater religious freedom. In the Middle Colonies, the situation was different. New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware were more diverse, both economically and culturally. The soils were more fertile than in New England, and agriculture played an important role. Cereals in particular were cultivated, which is why this region is sometimes referred to as the breadbasket of the colonies. Cities such as New York and Philadelphia developed into important trading centers. People of different origins met there: English, Dutch, Germans, Swedes, Scots, Irish, Jews, and other groups. Pennsylvania was particularly closely associated with William Penn and the Quakers. The Quakers held religious beliefs that differed from many other Christian groups. They emphasized inner piety, equality before God, and often rejected violence. Pennsylvania therefore became a refuge for many people who had experienced religious persecution in Europe or other colonies. This greater openness made the Middle Colonies one of the most diverse regions in British North America. Of course, even this diversity did not mean that all people were equal. Nevertheless, a comparatively pluralistic society developed there. The Southern Colonies, in turn, differed markedly from New England and the Middle Colonies. The climate was warmer, the growing seasons longer, and the soils in many regions were well suited for the cultivation of export products. In Virginia and Maryland, tobacco was mainly grown. In South Carolina and Georgia, rice and indigo later played an important role. These products were destined for the European market and could bring high profits. This created a plantation economy in the South based on large land holdings. This form of economy had enormous social consequences. While there were many smaller farmers, traders, and craftsmen in the North, a stronger social hierarchy developed in the South. At the top were rich plantation owners who had great political and economic influence. Among them lived smaller farmers, tenants, and farm workers. However, the increasing importance of slavery was particularly decisive. Initially, many European contract workers also worked in the South, but over time more and more enslaved Africans were brought to the colonies. Their work formed the basis of the wealth of many plantations. Slavery was not only an economic system, but also a system of brutal violence and deprivation of rights. Enslaved people were considered property, sold, inherited, and forced to work in harsh conditions. Families could be torn apart, corporal punishment was common, and legally enslaved people had little protection. At the same time, despite oppression, many preserved cultural traditions, developed new communities, and resisted in different ways, by fleeing, refusing to work, sabotage, or uprising. Slavery also existed in the northern and central colonies, albeit in a different form and usually to a lesser extent than in the South. This is important, because the later idea that slavery was only a southern problem is historically incomplete. Ports in the North benefited from Atlantic trade, which included trade in enslaved people and products of slave labor. The economic ties between North America, the Caribbean, Africa, and Europe were closely intertwined. Politically, the colonies developed their own forms of self-government early on. Although each colony was under British sovereignty, everyday life was often shaped by local assemblies, elected representatives, and colonial elites. In Virginia, the House of Burgesses was founded in 1619, one of the first representative assemblies in North America. Other colonies also developed parliaments or assemblies in which at least part of the white male population was represented. These political experiences later became important when the colonists began to resist British interference. However, this self-administration was very limited. Political rights usually only applied to free white men with property. Women, enslaved people, many poor men, and indigenous peoples were excluded. Nevertheless, a political culture emerged in the colonies, in which many settlers were accustomed to managing local affairs themselves. They paid taxes, organized militias, built roads, regulated trade, and decided on local laws. This experience led to later interventions from London being perceived as a threat. For a long time, relations with Great Britain were not only marked by conflicts. Many colonists felt they were British subjects and were proud of their rights as Englishmen. They benefited from the protection of the British Navy, trade in the empire, and cultural connections to Europe. British goods, books, fashions, and political ideas shaped life in the colonies. At the same time, there were thousands of kilometers of ocean between London and North America. This distance meant that the colonies often acted relatively independently in everyday life. Another important aspect was the relationship with the indigenous peoples. The expansion of the colonies repeatedly led to conflicts over land. European settlers claimed ever larger areas, cleared forests, founded villages and farms and displaced indigenous communities. There were wars, alliances, treaties, and betrayal. Some indigenous groups tried to play the European powers off against each other in order to strengthen their own position. Others put up armed resistance to the ongoing expansion. For the colonies, land was a promise of prosperity and independence. For many indigenous peoples, it meant the loss of their livelihoods. Despite all the differences, the 13 colonies also developed similarities over time. They spoke mostly English, were integrated into the British trading system, and shared certain political ideas. Many colonists believed in property rights, local self-government, and the rights of free British subjects. At the same time, trade, newspapers, religious movements, and joint wars created a stronger sense of connection between the colonies. The 18th century was particularly important. The population grew strongly, new cities emerged, trade increased, and the colonies became more economically important. At the same time, they became more self-confident. Many people, at least within the white population, no longer saw themselves as dependent settlers on the fringes of the British Empire, but as societies with their own interests. The colonies were not yet a common country, but they were no longer just scattered outposts of Europe. On the eve of the Revolution, the 13 colonies were thus a contradictory space. They stood for religious diversity, economic opportunities, and political self-government, but also for slavery, land grabbing, and social inequality. They were British-influenced, but increasingly developed their own identities. They were different from each other, but connected by trade, shared experiences, and conflicts. It was precisely from this mixture that the movement directed against Great Britain later emerged. The next chapter therefore deals with the question of why the relationship between the colonies and the motherland broke down. How did loyal British subjects become revolutionaries? Why did taxes, trade laws, and political participation lead to a conflict that eventually led to independence? Chapter 4: Conflicts with Britain and the Road to Revolution. For a long time, many people in the 13 colonies did not see themselves as opponents of Great Britain. On the contrary, they saw themselves as British subjects, proud of English rights, British culture, and the protection of the empire. Many colonists traded with British merchants, read British newspapers, wore British clothing, and felt politically connected to the motherland. But in the course of the 18th century, this relationship changed more and more. Loyalty turned into mistrust, mistrust turned into resistance, and resistance finally gave rise to a revolution. An important background was the 7 Years' War, often referred to as the French and Indian War in North America. This war lasted from 1754 to 1763 and was part of a worldwide conflict between European great powers. In North America, Great Britain and France faced each other in particular. Both powers fought for influence, land, and trade routes. Many indigenous nations were drawn into this conflict, some on the side of France, others on the side of Britain, and still others trying to assert their own interests between the European powers. In the end, Great Britain won. France lost large parts of its North American colonial empire. For the British colonists, this initially seemed to be a great success, because the French threat in the north and west was largely eliminated. But the victory came at a high price. Great Britain was heavily in debt due to the war. The British government now felt that the colonies should make a greater contribution to the cost of the empire. After all, from the British point of view, the war had also served to protect them. This is exactly where one of the central conflicts began. The colonists saw the matter differently. Many of them had fought in the war themselves, provided militias, or bore economic burdens. They were also accustomed to their own colonial assemblies deciding on internal affairs and taxes. Although they accepted membership of the British Empire in principle, they did not want the Parliament in London to impose direct taxes on them without their consent. This developed into the famous principle, "No taxation without representation." This sentence summed up a central problem. The colonists had no elected representatives in the British Parliament. The British government argued that Parliament represented the entire empire, including the colonies. However, many colonists rejected this idea. For them, real political representation could only mean that people could elect their representatives themselves. When London decided on taxes without the colonists being involved, they perceived it as an attack on their rights as free British subjects. The first major point of contention after the war was the Royal Proclamation of 1763. It stipulated that settlers should not settle west of the Appalachian Mountains without further ado. From the British point of view, this rule was intended to prevent new conflicts with indigenous peoples and to regulate the administration of the new territories. However, many colonists felt it was a limitation. Land speculators, farmers and settlers who wanted to move west were particularly outraged. For them, land in the West was a chance for prosperity and independence. The fact that the British Crown limited this expansion reinforced the feeling that London was acting against colonial interests. Shortly afterwards, new tax laws followed. In 1764, Great Britain passed the Sugar Act, which regulated tariffs on sugar and other goods and was intended to combat smuggling more strongly. Many traders in the colonies saw this as an intervention in their trade. Even greater outrage was triggered by the Stamp Act in 1765. This law required that many printed products in the colonies had to be provided with a tax stamp for a fee. Newspapers, contracts, licenses, playing cards, and numerous other documents were affected. The Stamp Act therefore affected not only traders, but also lawyers, printers, businessmen, and many politically active colonists. The resistance to the Stamp Act was fierce. In several colonies, there were protests, boycotts, and intimidation of British tax officials. Groups such as the Sons of Liberty organized actions against the law. They used newspapers, leaflets, meetings, and public demonstrations to stir up anti-London sentiment. Some protests remained peaceful, others became violent. Tax officials were threatened, their homes attacked, and symbols of British authority were publicly mocked. The resistance showed that the colonists were increasingly willing to stand together against measures taken by the motherland. The Stamp Act Congress of 1765 was particularly important, with representatives of several colonies meeting to protest against the law. This was an important step, because the colonies did not just act individually, but began to formulate their interests together. They declared that only their own colonial assemblies had the right to levy direct taxes. The printing had an effect. In 1766, the Stamp Act was repealed. But at the same time, the British Parliament passed the Declaratory Act. In it stated that it had the right in principle to legislate for the colonies in all cases. The immediate dispute was thus over, the basic conflict remained. In the following years, the situation worsened further. In 1767, Great Britain introduced the Townshend Acts. These laws levied taxes on goods such as glass, paper, paint, lead, and tea. Again, many colonists reacted by boycotting British goods. Women in particular played an important role in this, even though they had hardly any political rights officially. They organized households, dispensed with imported products, produced their own fabrics, and thus supported economic resistance. Political protest therefore took place not only in meetings and newspapers, but also in everyday life. Boston developed into a center of resistance during this time. The city had a vibrant political culture, many printers, merchants, and craftsmen, as well as strong opposition groups. The British government increasingly viewed Boston as a troubled place that needed to be controlled. Therefore, British soldiers were stationed in the city. Their presence exacerbated tensions. Many residents perceived the soldiers as an occupying force. At the same time, soldiers competed with workers for part-time jobs, which intensified social conflicts. On March 5, 1770, the situation escalated in the so-called Boston Massacre. After clashes between residents and British soldiers, soldiers opened fire on a crowd. 5 colonists died. From the British point of view, it was a chaotic escalation in a threatening situation. For many colonists, however, the event became a symbol of British oppression. Patriotic propaganda portrayed the killed men as victims of tyrannical violence. Paul Revere in particular spread a famous account of the incident, which showed the British soldiers as cold-blooded perpetrators. The event thus became an important means of mobilizing resistance against Great Britain. Although some taxes were later repealed, the tax on tea remained. Tea was not only an everyday product, but also a symbol of the question of whether Britain had the right to tax the colonies without their consent. In 1773, Parliament passed the Tea Act. He was supposed to help the ailing British East India Company by making it easier for them to sell tea in the colonies. The tea even became cheaper as a result. But many colonists saw a trap in this. When they bought the tea, they indirectly accepted the right of taxation of the British Parliament. The answer was the Boston Tea Party. In December 1773, colonists disguised as indigenous men invaded ships in Boston Harbor and threw large quantities of tea into the water. This action was spectacular, symbolic, and provocative. For those involved, it was an act of resistance against unjust rule. For the British government, it was destruction of property and open rebellion. London decided to react harshly. In 1774, the so-called coercive acts, often called intolerable acts in the colonies, followed. Boston Harbor was closed until the destroyed tea was paid for. Massachusetts self-government was restricted, British officials were given greater protection, and soldiers could be quartered more easily in private buildings. These measures were intended to punish Massachusetts and deter other colonies. But they had the opposite effect. Many colonists saw this as an attack on the freedom of all colonies, not just Boston. In the same year, the First Continental Congress met in Philadelphia. Representatives from 12 colonies met to discuss a joint response. Many were not yet interested in complete independence. Many wanted a return to the old rights and recognition of colonial self-government. But the meeting showed how close the colonies had already come. They organized boycotts, formulated complaints, and explained their rights. The resistance became more coordinated and politically mature. At the same time, both sides were preparing for violence. In Massachusetts, colonists collected weapons and formed militias. The British government wanted to confiscate these supplies and intimidate the leaders of the resistance. In April 1775, the first battles between British troops and colonial militiamen took place near Lexington and Concord. No one could pretend anymore that it was just a dispute about taxes. Blood had been shed, and the conflict had turned into war. The road to revolution was therefore not a sudden break, but a process. Many colonists did not start out as revolutionaries. They initially wanted to defend their rights within the British Empire. But every new tax, every restriction of self-government, every military measure, and every harsh reaction from London further dwindled confidence. At the same time, networks of resistance, common political ideas, and a growing feeling that one's own freedom could only be secured against Great Britain emerged in the colonies. It should not be forgotten that colonial society itself was divided. Not everyone supported the revolution. Many people remained loyal to the British Crown and were called loyalists. Others were indecisive or, above all, wanted to avoid being drawn into the conflict. Enslaved people, indigenous peoples, and women, on the other hand, had their own perspectives on this dispute because the freedom rhetoric of the colonists often did not include them. The revolution promised freedom, but not for everyone. Nevertheless, by 1775, a point had been reached at which a peaceful solution became increasingly unlikely. The colonies had learned to protest together. They had experienced that economic boycotts could have a political effect. They had set up their own assemblies, committees, and militias. And many began to see British rule no longer as a protection, but as a threat. The next chapter deals with the open rupture, the American Revolution, the War of Independence, and the Declaration of 1776. Then resistance to individual laws becomes the claim to found a new country. Chapter 5: The American Revolution and the Declaration of Independence. When the first shots were fired at Lexington and Concord in April 1775, Many involved did not yet realize that this would lead to a full-scale war of independence. Numerous colonists initially continued to see their resistance as a struggle for their rights within the British Empire. They did not necessarily want to found their own country, but wanted Britain to respect their self-government and withdraw the controversial laws. But with each month that the conflict continued, a return to the old order became less likely. The violence had created a new reality. After the battles of Lexington and Concord, resistance spread rapidly. Colonial militias besieged British troops in Boston, and the situation escalated further. In May 1775, the Second Continental Congress met in Philadelphia. Representatives from the colonies met again, this time under much more dramatic circumstances. Congress had to decide how to organize the military resistance. One of the most important decisions was the formation of a joint Continental Army. George Washington, a plantation owner and former officer from Virginia, was appointed commander-in-chief. His appointment was politically wise, because it showed that not only New England but also the southern colonies were part of the resistance. George Washington faced an enormously difficult task. The Continental Army was initially poorly equipped, inadequately trained, and consisted of men who often served only for short periods. There was a lack of weapons, clothing, food, ammunition, and money. The British Army, on the other hand, was one of the strongest military powers in the world. It was professionally organized, had experienced officers, and was supported by the powerful British Navy. On paper, the outcome of the war seemed to be clearly in favor of Britain. But the colonists had other advantages. They fought in familiar territory, could count on local support, and did not necessarily have to win the war with great victories. It was enough if they held out long enough, and the costs of the war became too high for Great Britain politically and economically. In addition, the conflict was more complicated for the British than it initially appeared. They had to control a huge area, send supplies across the Atlantic, and at the same time deal with a population that was by no means unanimously loyal. In June 1775, the Battle of Bunker Hill near Boston took place. Although the British eventually took the battlefield, they suffered heavy losses. For the colonists, the battle was a moral success, as it showed that militiamen could put up serious resistance to British troops. The war would not be as easy to win as some in London had hoped. At the same time, it became clear that the conflict could become bloody and protracted. While the military situation came to a head, the political mood in the colonies also changed. More and more people began to ask whether a compromise with Great Britain was still possible at all. An important impulse came at the beginning of 1776 with the publication of the work Common Sense by Thomas Paine. Paine argued in clear, understandable language that it was nonsensical for an entire continent to be ruled by a distant island. He attacked the monarchy in principle and openly demanded independence. The script spread quickly and reached many people who had previously hesitated. It helped to transform the idea of independence from a radical idea into a broad political demand. In the summer of 1776, the moment had come when the Continental Congress prepared the final break. A commission was commissioned to formulate a statement. It included Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and Benjamin Franklin. The main draft was written by Jefferson. On July 4, 1776, Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence. This date later became the national holiday of the United States. The Declaration of Independence is one of the most famous political documents in world history. Its core is the assertion that all human beings are created equal and possess inalienable rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Governments, according to the Declaration, receive their power from the consent of the governed. If a government destroys these rights, the people have the right to change or abolish them. These ideas were in the tradition of the Enlightenment and took up ideas of natural rights, popular sovereignty, and the right to resist. At the same time, the statement contains a long list of complaints against King George III. The colonists accused him of violating their rights, restricting their self-government, deploying troops against them, and supporting unjust laws. This list was intended to show that the separation from Britain was not frivolous, but as a necessary response to repeated oppression. The Declaration was therefore not only a philosophical text, but also a political argument to the world public. But the big words of the Declaration were in deep contradiction to reality from the beginning. If all men were created equal, why was this not true of enslaved Africans? Why didn't women have political rights? Why were indigenous peoples not respected as equal nations? Many of the men who demanded freedom owned enslaved people themselves or benefited from a society that excluded large parts of the population. This contradiction was to shape the history of the USA for a long time to come. The Declaration of Independence was later ignored by both oppressors and used by reform movements to demand real equality. The war was not won with the Declaration. On the contrary, the conflict had now finally become a struggle for independence. Britain could no longer treat the colonists as protesting subjects, but regarded them as rebels. The military situation was initially difficult for the Americans. In 1776, the British conquered New York, and Washington's army had to retreat. Morale sank, many soldiers deserted, and the future of the Revolution seemed uncertain. In this critical situation, Washington achieved an important surprise success at the end of 1776. On the night after Christmas, he crossed the Delaware River with his troops and attacked Hessian soldiers in Trenton who were fighting on the British side. The victory was not huge militarily, but psychologically enormously important. He showed that the Continental Army was still capable of acting and gave new hope to the revolutionary cause. Shortly afterwards, another success at Princeton followed. The decisive turning point came in 1777 with the Battle of Saratoga. There, American troops succeeded in forcing a British army to surrender. Saratoga was so important because it convinced France to officially enter the war on the side of the Americans. France wanted to weaken Britain and now saw a realistic chance of helping the rebels. With French support, the situation changed fundamentally. The Americans received money, weapons, soldiers, military advice, and above all, support from the French Navy. The war thus became an international conflict. In addition to France, Spain and the Netherlands later also took a stand against Great Britain, albeit with their own interests. Britain no longer had to fight only in North America, but defend its power worldwide. This international dimension was crucial to the American Revolution. Without foreign support, the victory of the colonies would have been much less likely. Nevertheless, the war remained hard. The winter camps of the Continental Army, especially Valley Forge in the winter of 1777-78, became symbols of deprivation and perseverance. Soldiers suffered from cold, hunger, disease, and poor care. Many did not have adequate clothing or shoes. At the same time, the army was better organized and trained there, among others by the Prussian officer Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben. A loose force gradually became a more disciplined army. The population was also deeply divided. Not all colonists supported the revolution. Loyalists remained loyal to the British Crown, partly out of conviction, partly out of economic interests or fear of chaos. In some regions, civil war-like conditions arose between patriots and loyalists. For indigenous nations, the war was also of great importance. Many supported Britain because they hoped that a British victory would limit the settlers' western expansion. Others tried to remain neutral or to take advantage of the situation. For enslaved people, the war also opened up room for maneuver. The British promised freedom to some enslaved people if they fought or fled on their side. Thousands took advantage of this opportunity. The last major turning point came in 1781 at Yorktown, Virginia. There, a British army under General Cornwallis was surrounded by American and French troops, while the French Navy blocked British support at sea. Cornwallis had to capitulate. This defeat did not immediately mean the official end of the war, but it made it clear that Britain had little realistic prospect of reconquering the colonies. In 1783, the independence of the United States was officially recognized in the Treaty of Paris. Great Britain accepted the USA as a sovereign state. The new land received large areas as far as the Mississippi River. For the Americans, this was a huge success. 13 colonies had become an independent state. But the victory was also the beginning of new problems. How should this new country be governed? How much power should a central government have? What rights should the individual states retain? What did freedom mean in a society that continued to allow slavery and displaced indigenous peoples? The American Revolution was therefore more than a war against Britain. It was a political experiment, a struggle for self-determination, and an event full of contradictions. It gave rise to ideas that had a global impact: popular sovereignty, individual rights, resistance to tyranny, and the idea that governments must be based on consent. At the same time, the new freedom remained limited and incomplete. Im naxen capital get es darum, wie aus dem Revolutionären Sieg ein funktionierender Staat entstehen sollt. Die Gründung der Vereinigten Staaten, die Schwachung der Ersten Ordnung, die Verfassung von 1787 und die Bill of Rights. Chapter 6: The Founding of the United States and the Constitution. After the victory in the War of Independence, the 13 former colonies were faced with a daunting task. They had successfully broken away from Great Britain, but that was far from clear how the new country was supposed to function. They no longer wanted a king. Too strong a central government seemed dangerous to many, because they feared the very oppression they had just fought. At the same time, the new country had to make joint decisions, pay debts, regulate trade, resolve conflicts between the individual states, and assert itself externally. The Revolution had given birth to the United States, but now it had to learn to be a state. During the war, the former colonies had already created their first common order, the Articles of Confederation, on German example, Confederation Articles. They were passed in 1777 and came into full force in 1781. This order made the 13 states a loose alliance. The individual states retained a great deal of power, while the joint government was deliberately kept weak. This was no coincidence. Many Americans were afraid of central authority. They believed that freedom could best be protected if power remained as close as possible to the individual states and their citizens. But this first order had major weaknesses. Congress could pass resolutions, but had little opportunity to enforce them. He could not levy direct taxes, but was dependent on cash payments from the individual states. If they did not pay, the federal government would remain powerless. There were also problems with trade. Individual states levied their own tariffs, pursued their own economic interests, and argued with each other. There was no strong joint executive, i.e., no president who could execute laws. A national court system was also largely absent. Although the USA was independent, it often seemed uncoordinated and weak internally. These problems became particularly clear in the years after the war. The young republic had high debts, both to its own citizens and to foreign donors. Many former soldiers were waiting for payment. Farmers suffered from taxes, debts, and economic difficulties. There were riots in some regions. A particularly important event was Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts in 1786 and 1787, when indebted farmers protested against high taxes, lawsuits, and the threat of expropriation. Some took up arms and tried to close courts so that no further debt collection could take place. For many political leaders, Shays' Rebellion was a warning signal. They feared that the young republic could sink into chaos if the joint government did not become stronger. Men like George Washington, James Madison, and Alexander Hamilton came to the conclusion that the Articles of Confederation were not enough. They wanted to create a new order that was stronger, but still protected the freedom of citizens. It is precisely from this field of tension that the American Constitution emerged. In 1787, delegates from 12 states met in Philadelphia. Rhode Island did not participate because it rejected a stronger central government. Officially, the convention was supposed to revise the existing Articles of Confederation. But it soon became clear that many delegates wanted to go further. They didn't just want to improve, they wanted to design a completely new system of government. The meetings took place in secret so that open discussions could take place. George Washington was elected chairman of the convention, which gave the meeting great prestige. One of the central questions was how much power the new federal government should receive. The delegates wanted to avoid the emergence of a kind of monarchy again. At the same time, the government should be strong enough to levy taxes, enforce laws, regulate trade, and represent the country to the outside world. The solution was a system of separation of powers. Power was divided into three areas: the legislature, which makes laws, the executive branch, which executes laws, and the judiciary, which interprets laws and decides disputes. The legislature became Congress. It still consists of two chambers, the House of Representatives and the Senate. This structure arose from an important compromise between large and small states. Large states wanted representation to be calculated according to population, because then they would have more influence. Small states feared being outvoted by the big ones and wanted equal votes for all states. The so-called Great Compromise solved this conflict. In the House of Representatives, the number of representatives is based on the population. In the Senate, each state receives 2 senators. In this way, both interests were partially taken into account. The executive branch was transferred to the president. Here, too, the delegates proceeded cautiously. They wanted a leader who was capable of acting, but who was not allowed to become too powerful. The president should be commander-in-chief of the armed forces, be able to execute laws, conduct diplomacy, and appoint certain officials. At the same time, his power was limited. Congress could pass laws, approve money, and in extreme cases, initiate impeachment proceedings. The president, in turn, was given a veto right against laws, which Congress was able to overrule with a sufficient majority. The judiciary was to be formed by a Supreme Court and other federal courts. Its task was to decide disputes under federal law and to interpret the Constitution. Later, the Supreme Court developed the power to review laws for constitutionality. This made the judiciary an important part of the system of checks and balances. This principle is called checks and balances. No part of the government should be able to rule alone. All violence should control and limit the others. Behind this was a realistic view of humanity. The constitutional fathers assumed that power can always be abused. Therefore, power should not simply be entrusted to good people, but should be curbed by institutions. Freedom should be protected not only by fine words, but by a system in which ambition controls ambition. Another central principle was federalism. The USA did not become a completely loose confederation of states or a completely centralized state. Instead, the federal government and individual states shared power. The federal government was given certain tasks, such as foreign policy, defense, currency, trade between states, and taxes. The individual states retained many responsibilities in everyday life, for example in local laws, education, property issues, and internal administration. This division was intended to enable unity without completely relinquishing the independence of the states. But the Constitution was not only a masterpiece of political theory. It was also a document full of compromises, and some of them were morally deeply problematic. This is particularly evident in slavery. Although the Declaration of Independence had spoken of freedom and equality, slavery remained. The Southern states wanted to protect their slave economy and threatened not to agree to a constitution without corresponding concessions. The result was several compromises in favor of the slave owners. The best known was the 3/5 Compromise. For the calculation of the population in the House of Representatives and for taxes, enslaved people should be counted at 3/5. This was a brutal contradiction. People who were denied political rights at the same time increased the political power of their owners. In addition, the international slave trade was not immediately banned, but could only be restricted later. These compromises show that the new republic was built from the beginning on an unresolved conflict that would explode decades later in civil war. After the Constitution was drafted in 1787, it had to be ratified by the states. This resulted in an intense political debate. The proponents of the Constitution called themselves Federalists. Among them were Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay. They argued that a stronger federal government was necessary to ensure order, security, and economic stability. In the Federalist Papers, they explained in detail why the new Constitution could not destroy freedom, but protect it. The opponents were called anti-federalists. They feared that the new central government could become too powerful and threaten the rights of citizens and individual states. They were particularly critical of the fact that the original Constitution did not contain an explicit catalog of fundamental rights. Why, they asked, should a strong government be trusted if the most important freedoms were not explicitly protected? This criticism was decisive because it led to the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights comprises the first 10 amendments to the Constitution and was ratified in 1791. It guarantees fundamental rights such as freedom of religion, freedom of expression, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, the right to a fair trial, and protection from arbitrary searches. For many citizens, these additions were an important safeguard against state abuse of power. They made it clear that the federal government was not allowed to do everything, but was bound by certain rights. In 1789, the new Constitution came into force, and George Washington was unanimously elected the first President of the United States. His presidency was formative in many respects, because there were no role models for many things. How should a president act? How powerful should his office be? How should he work with Congress? Washington's decisions created political traditions, including the voluntary limitation to 2 terms, which was later long considered an unwritten law. The founding of the United States was thus an extraordinary political experiment. For the first time, a modern state emerged that was explicitly based on popular sovereignty, a written constitution, the separation of powers and fundamental rights. At the same time, this experiment was limited. Political participation applied primarily to white men, often with property. Women, indigenous peoples, enslaved people, and many free blacks were excluded or severely disadvantaged. The ideals were great, but their implementation remained incomplete. It is precisely this contradiction that makes the early history of the USA so significant. The Constitution created stable institutions that still exist today. It enabled political development, changes of power, and legal debates. At the same time, it preserved conflicts that were not resolved but postponed. The question of who really belonged to we the people remained open and was fought out again and again in the centuries that followed. The next chapter is about how the young republic turned its gaze to the West. Expansion beyond the Appalachian Mountains, the Louisiana Purchase, the idea of the manifest destiny, and the increasing displacement of indigenous peoples were intended to expand the country geographically, but also create new conflicts. Chapter 7: Expansion to the West and the idea of the manifest destiny. After the founding of the United States, the new country was initially concentrated mainly on the Atlantic coast. The 13 former colonies were located in eastern North America, but early on many Americans turned their gaze to the west. Behind the Appalachian Mountains lay huge areas that, from the point of view of many settlers, promised opportunities for land, prosperity, and independence. For indigenous nations, on the other hand, this movement to the west increasingly meant threats, displacement, and violence. Expansion became a central part of American history, and at the same time one of its greatest moral burdens. Even before independence, settlers had tried to gain land west of the Appalachian Mountains. The British Crown had restricted this after the 7 Years' War with the Proclamation of 1763 to avoid conflicts with indigenous peoples. After the Revolution, this border was abolished. In the Treaty of Paris in 1783, Great Britain recognized the independence of the United States and ceded territories to the new state as far as the Mississippi River. This means that the country grew considerably on paper. But these areas were by no means empty. They were home to numerous indigenous nations that did not simply recognize either British or American claims. For many Americans, land in the West was more than just possessions. It was a symbol of freedom. Those who owned land could found a farm, become economically independent, and gain political weight as citizens. Especially for poorer white settlers, the West offered hope for social advancement. This idea was deeply embedded in American identity. The United States appeared as a land of unlimited opportunities in which everyone could build their own life through work and courage. But this narrative ignored the fact that these possibilities were often based on the expropriation of others. The federal government was faced with the task of organizing the new areas. An important act was the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. It regulated how territories northwest of the Ohio River could be administered and later admitted to the Union as new states. This was significant because it showed that the U.S. did not simply want to establish a colonial empire with dependent provinces, but that new territories could in principle become equal states. At the same time, the Northwest Ordinance included a ban on slavery in this area. This made it clear early on that westward expansion was closely linked to the question of whether new states would be free or slave-owning. The expansion also intensified conflicts with indigenous peoples. The U.S. government concluded numerous treaties with indigenous nations, but these treaties were often enforced under pressure, deception, or after military defeats. Many were later broken as soon as settlers or politicians wanted new land. Indigenous nations tried to assert themselves in different ways, through diplomacy, adaptation, alliances, or armed resistance. In the 1790s, heavy fighting broke out in the Northwest Territory between U.S. troops and a confederation of indigenous peoples. It was only after the defeat of indigenous forces at the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794 that the U.S. government was able to expand its control in the region. A huge step west came in 1803 with the Louisiana Purchase. President Thomas Jefferson bought a huge area west of the Mississippi River from France. For $15 million, the USA acquired land that stretched from the Mississippi to the Rocky Mountains. This almost doubled the area of the country. Jefferson saw this purchase as an opportunity to realize his vision of a republic of independent farmers. He believed that a society of free landowners was the best basis for democracy. But the Louisiana Purchase also had a problematic side. France sold territories over which it had little actual control in many places, and in which numerous indigenous nations lived. For them, the purchase did not mean that their land suddenly legally belonged to the USA. Nevertheless, the American government treated the acquisition as the basis for future claims. Shortly after the purchase, Jefferson sent the Lewis and Clark expedition to explore the West from 1804 to 1806. Meriwether Lewis and William Clark were to create maps, document plants and animals, examine trade opportunities, and make contact with indigenous groups. The expedition later became a myth of American pioneering spirit. In fact, however, it was also part of a state project that prepared the way for later control over the West. In the early 19th century, the settlement movement continued to increase. New states were admitted to the Union, roads and canals were built, rivers were used as transport routes, and cities were founded. The Erie Canal, opened in 1825, connected the Great Lakes to the Hudson River and thus to the Atlantic Ocean. This made trade between the West and the East Coast much easier. Agricultural products could be transported more quickly, and settlers could reach new areas more easily. Infrastructure thus became an engine of expansion. At the same time, violence against indigenous peoples intensified. This became particularly clear under President Andrew Jackson. For many white Americans, Jackson embodied the rise of the common man and the power of young democracy. For indigenous nations, however, his policies were catastrophic. In 1830, he signed the Indian Removal Act. This law allowed for the expulsion of indigenous peoples from their homelands in the Southeast to areas west of the Mississippi River. Officially, this was often presented as resettlement. In reality, it was forced eviction in favor of white settlers and plantation owners. The Trail of Tears is particularly well known. The Cherokee had tried to protect themselves against expulsion through adaptation, agriculture, their own constitution, and legal means. They even sued before the Supreme Court. Nevertheless, they were forcibly expelled from their homeland in the Southeast in the 1830s. Thousands died of hunger, disease, cold, and exhaustion on the way west. Similar fates befell other indigenous peoples such as the Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminoles. The expansion of the USA was therefore not only a story of pioneers and covered wagons, but also a story of state-organized expulsion. In the 1840s, westward expansion took on a particularly influential ideological form, the Manifest Destiny. This term meant that it was the obvious destiny of the United States to spread across the North American continent. Many supporters believed that the United States had a special mission, to bring democracy, civilization, and progress to the West. This idea combined nationalism, religious beliefs, racism, and economic interests. Expansion did not appear as a political decision, but as fate or divine mandate. This idea helped to justify aggressive territorial policy. One example is Texas. Originally, Texas belonged to Mexico. In the 1820s, many American settlers settled there, often with the approval of the Mexican government, but increasingly with their own interests. Conflicts arose over slavery, cultural differences, and political control, among other things. In 1836, Texas declared its independence from Mexico. After battles, including the famous Battle of the Alamo, the Republic of Texas was created. In 1845, Texas was annexed by the United States. This significantly exacerbated tensions with Mexico. Shortly thereafter, the Mexican-American War of 1846 to 1848 broke out. The U.S. and Mexico were arguing over the Texas border, but behind it was a greater American interest in areas in the West, including California and New Mexico. The war ended with a clear victory for the USA. In the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, Mexico had to cede huge territories. These included parts of what is now the states of California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and Wyoming. The USA now stretched from the Atlantic to the Pacific. For many Americans, this was the fulfillment of manifest destiny. For Mexico, it was a traumatic loss of large parts of the country. For indigenous peoples in the West, it meant that a new power was now laying claim to their land. And for the USA itself, the territorial growth brought new conflicts. The question of slavery in particular became more and more dangerous. Should slavery be allowed or banned in the new Western territories? Each new state could change the political balance between free and slave-holding states. The gold rush in California from 1848 onwards further accelerated the settlement of the West. When gold was found, hundreds of thousands of people flocked to California. Americans from the East, Latin Americans, Europeans, Chinese, and people from many other regions. Cities grew rapidly, trade routes changed, and California was admitted to the Union as a state as early as 1850. But this boom also had dark sides. Indigenous populations of California were displaced, exploited, murdered, and decimated by disease. Environmental destruction, violence, and racial discrimination accompanied the gold rush. The expansion to the West deeply shaped the self-image of the USA. She created myths of pioneers, cowboys, settlers, freedom, and adventure. These images were later repeated again and again in literature, art, films, and school textbooks. But behind the myth lay a more complex reality. The West was not an empty space, but a contested living space. Expansion brought opportunities for some, but loss and violence for others. It promoted democracy for white settlers while destroying indigenous rights and exacerbating the slavery issue. By the middle of the 19th century, the United States had expanded its territory enormously. A young republic on the Atlantic coast had become a continental state. But this success came at a price. The expansion to the West not only triggered new conflicts with indigenous peoples in Mexico, but also brought the unresolved question of slavery increasingly into focus. The larger the country became, the more difficult it became to suppress the contradiction between freedom and lack of freedom. The next chapter is therefore about slavery, plantation farming, and the growing contradictions between North and South. While the USA expanded outwards, It was divided internally by a conflict that would eventually lead to civil war. Chapter 8: Slavery, Plantation Economy, and Social Contradictions. The history of the United States cannot be understood without the history of slavery. Even in colonial times, the work of enslaved Africans had become a central part of the economy, especially in the southern colonies. After independence, this system did not disappear, although the new nation invoked freedom, equality, and natural rights. On the contrary, slavery became even more important in many regions of the South in the 19th century. This created an ever deeper contradiction between the ideals of the American Revolution and social reality. In the southern states, an economic system developed that was strongly influenced by plantations. Large landowners grew export products that were sold in international markets. Initially, tobacco played a particularly important role, especially in Virginia and Maryland. Later, rice, indigo, sugarcane, and above all, cotton became decisive. Cotton became the most important product of the South in the 19th century. It was closely linked to industrialization, as textile mills in Britain, the northern United States, and other parts of Europe needed enormous quantities of raw cotton. A technical change reinforced this development: the cotton gin, a machine for faster separation of cotton fibers from seeds. It was patented by Eli Whitney in 1793. Actually, this machine could have made the work easier. In fact, however, it led to cotton cultivation becoming even more profitable. Plantation owners expanded their cultivation areas, especially in the so-called Deep South, i.e. in states such as Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and later Texas. To do this, they demanded more and more workers. The result was not a weakening, but a massive expansion of slavery. Although the international slave trade was officially banned in the United States in 1808, the trade in enslaved people remained within the country. It even became a cruel and lucrative business. Enslaved people were sold from older slave states such as Virginia or Maryland to the Deep South, where new cotton plantations were established. Families have been torn apart, children separated from parents, spouses sold, and communities destroyed. The so-called domestic trade in enslaved people was one of the most brutal pages in American history. For the enslaved people, life on plantations meant hard physical work, permanent control, and legal defenselessness. They were considered property according to the law of many southern states. They could be bought, sold, bequeathed, rented out, or used as collateral for loans. Their everyday life was marked by forced labor, threats of violence, and the constant danger of being separated from relatives. On cotton plantations, many had to work in the fields from early morning to evening. On sugarcane plantations, the conditions were often particularly deadly because the work was heavy, dangerous, and seasonally extremely intensive. But enslaved people were not only victims of a system. They preserved dignity, created family structures, developed religious and cultural expressions, and resisted. This resistance could be open or hidden. Some fled, others sabotaged tools, worked more slowly, feigned illness, or secretly preserved traditions and knowledge. There were also armed riots, such as the Nat Turner Uprising in Virginia in 1831. Such uprisings terrified slave-owning society and often led to even harsher laws. Nevertheless, they showed that the system was never based on consent, but was only maintained by force. Despite oppression, the culture of enslaved African Americans became an important basis of later American culture. In music, religion, language, narratives, and forms of community, African traditions were combined with new experiences in America. Religion in particular played a major role. Many enslaved people absorbed Christian elements, but interpreted them from their own experience of suffering and hope. The story of the exodus of the Israelites from Egyptian captivity became a powerful symbol of liberation. Spirituals and religious gatherings could provide comfort, strengthen community, and sometimes contain coded messages. While the South increasingly clung to slavery, the North developed in a different direction. Although there was also racism and slavery in earlier times, the economy was increasingly based on free wage labor, trade, industry, and small farms. In many northern states, slavery was gradually abolished or lost importance after the Revolution. However, this did not mean that black people in the North had equal rights. They were often discriminated against, were not allowed to vote in many places, had poorer job opportunities, and were socially excluded. Nevertheless, the social order of the North differed significantly from the plantation economy of the South. These economic differences led to different political interests. The North often wanted protective tariffs to protect its own industry from foreign competition. The South, on the other hand, was often against high tariffs because it imported industrial goods and exported its cotton. The North invested more in railways, factories, banks, and cities. The South remained more rural and agrarian. These differences did not mean that North and South were completely separate worlds. In fact, they were economically intertwined. Northern banks, traders, shipowners, and textile factories profited indirectly or directly from cotton and thus from slave labor. Nevertheless, different models of society developed. At the center of the tensions was the question of whether slavery should be allowed to spread further west. With each new territory that the U.S. gained, the same question arose: should slavery be allowed there or not? This question was not only morally, but also politically explosive. In the Senate, the balance between free states and slave states was decisive. If one side received more states, it could gain more political influence. As a result, new states were often only admitted within the framework of complicated compromises. An important compromise was the Missouri Compromise of 1820, in which Missouri wanted to be admitted to the Union as a slave state. To maintain the balance, Maine was accepted as a free state. At the same time, a line was established north of which slavery was to be prohibited in large parts of the Louisiana Territory. This compromise temporarily calmed the situation, but did not solve the basic problem. On the contrary, it showed how dangerous the question had already become. The conflict also became morally sharper. In the North, the abolitionist movement grew to demand the abolition of slavery. However, its members were not always in the majority. Many whites in the North rejected slavery, but still did not want full equality for black people. Radical abolitionists such as William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, and Harriet Tubman, on the other hand, called for a clear moral decision against slavery. Frederick Douglass, who himself had escaped from slavery, became one of the most important speakers and authors of the movement. He showed with particular power how hypocritical a country was that celebrated freedom and at the same time enslaved millions of people. Harriet Tubman became known for her work in the Underground Railroad network. This subway was not a real railroad, but a secret network of helpers, paths, and safe houses through which enslaved people could flee to free states or Canada. The escape was dangerous. Anyone caught had to reckon with severe punishment or resale. Nevertheless, many dared to take this step because freedom was stronger than fear. In the South, many slave owners reacted to criticism not with doubt, but with defense. While earlier generations had sometimes portrayed slavery as a necessary evil, many Southern politicians began to openly justify it as a positive good in the 19th century. They claimed that slavery was divinely ordained, natural, or even beneficial to the enslaved. Such arguments served to ideologically secure an inhumane system. At the same time, laws were tightened, the education of enslaved people was banned, freedom of movement was restricted, and criticism was suppressed. The fear of uprisings and loss of political power made the South increasingly uncompromising. Many slave owners saw any restriction on slavery as a threat to their entire society. They feared that a ban on spreading to new territories would lead to the end of the system in the long term. Therefore, they defended not only the existing slavery, but also their right to take them to new territories. As a result, the USA increasingly became a country with two opposing visions for the future. One was based on free labor, industrial development, urban growth, and a stronger federal government. The other was based on plantations, the agrarian elite, slave labor, and the emphasis on individual state rights, whereby these rights served primarily to protect slavery. Both systems were able to coexist for a time, but the expansion to the West made the conflict increasingly difficult to control. By the middle of the 19th century, slavery was no longer just a regional problem. It was the central political and moral question of the nation. Any compromise would only postpone the crisis further into the future. The ideals of the Declaration of Independence were increasingly at odds with reality. A country that presented freedom as its highest good kept millions of people in bondage. This contradiction could not be concealed permanently. The next chapter is about how these tensions eventually escalated: the dispute over new territories, the election of Abraham Lincoln, the secession of the Southern states, and the outbreak of the American Civil War. Chapter 9: The Civil War and the Abolition of Slavery. The American Civil War was the deepest turning point in the history of the United States. Between 1861 and 1865, Northern and Southern states fought each other in a war that nearly destroyed the country. It was about power, political order, economic interests, and the question of how much independence the individual states should have vis-a-vis the federal government. But the focus was above all on a conflict that had remained unresolved since the founding of the USA, slavery. For decades, compromises had tried to cover up this contradiction. But by the middle of the 19th century, it had become clear that the United States could not remain half free and half slave-owning permanently. After the Mexican-American War and the Great Expansion to the West, the question of whether slavery should be allowed in the new territories intensified. Each new state could change the political balance between free states and slave states. The Missouri Compromise had drawn a line temporarily in 1820, but this solution did not last permanently. With the Compromise of 1850, another attempt was made to calm tensions. California was admitted as a free state, while the South received a stricter fugitive slave law, among other things. This law also required people in free states to assist in the repatriation of escaped enslaved people. For many opponents of slavery in the North, this came as a shock, because now the federal government directly forced them to support the slavery system. The situation escalated further with the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. This law effectively abolished the old boundary line of the Missouri Compromise and allowed the inhabitants of the new territories of Kansas and Nebraska to decide for themselves whether they wanted to allow slavery. This principle was called popular sovereignty. In practice, however, it did not lead to peaceful democratic decision-making, but to violence. Proponents and opponents of slavery flocked to Kansas to influence the votes. There were armed clashes, arson, and murders. The region became known as Bleeding Kansas. Kansas showed that the slavery question could no longer be pacified by political formulas. The Supreme Court's decision in the Dred Scott case in 1857 also exacerbated the conflict. Dred Scott was an enslaved man who had sued because he had lived with his owner in areas where slavery was prohibited. The Supreme Court ruled against him, declaring that black people could not be citizens of the United States. In addition, the court questioned whether Congress had the right to prohibit slavery in territories at all. For opponents of slavery, this decision was proof that the slave owners were gaining more and more influence over the country's institutions. For many in the South, on the other hand, it was a confirmation of their rights. It was in this atmosphere that the Republican Party was born. It was not primarily a party that demanded the immediate abolition of slavery everywhere. Their central goal was initially to prevent the spread of slavery into new territories. Many Republicans believed that slavery would disappear in the long term if it could not continue to grow. For the Southern states, however, it was precisely this goal that seemed threatening. They saw it as an attack on their future, their economy, and their social order. Abraham Lincoln became the most important figure of this new party. Lincoln came from a humble background, worked his way up to become a lawyer and politician, and was an impressive speaker. He morally opposed slavery, but first emphasized that his main goal was not the immediate abolition in the existing slave states, but the preservation of the Union and the prevention of the spread of slavery. In a famous speech, he said that a house divided in itself could not exist. By this he meant that the USA could not survive permanently as a nation if it remained founded half on freedom and half on slavery. When Lincoln was elected president in 1860, it was the trigger for many Southern states to secede. Although Lincoln had received hardly any votes in many Southern states and had not yet taken any action against slavery, the political leaders of the South saw his election as a sign that they would lose control of the federal government in the long term. South Carolina declared its withdrawal from the Union in December 1860. Other Southern states followed. They founded the Confederate States of America with Jefferson Davis as president. The Confederation claimed that it was defending the rights of the individual states. But the crucial question was which right to defend: the right to maintain and extend slavery. Many contemporary documents of the Southern states made it openly clear that slavery was at the center of their secession. The political language of freedom and self-determination was thus used to protect a system of unfreedom. The war began in April 1861 when Confederate troops shelled Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. Lincoln then called on troops to put down the rebellion. Other Southern states joined the Confederacy. A political crisis turned into open war. Both sides initially believed that the conflict would be short. Many expected a quick victory. But this hope turned out to be an illusion. The Civil War became long, brutal, and costly. The North, the Union, had clear advantages. It had more population, more industry, more railways, more banks, and a stronger navy. The South, on the other hand, had experienced officers, fought on familiar terrain, and hoped to win through perseverance and possible support from Europe. Great Britain and France in particular were economically interested in cotton. But open recognition of the Confederacy failed to materialize, not least because slavery was increasingly outlawed internationally. In the first years of the war was difficult for the Union. The Confederacy achieved several military successes, especially in the East under General Robert E. Lee. Battles such as Bull Run, Antietam, Fredericksburg, and Chancellorsville showed the severity of the war. The weapons had become more modern, but many tactics still came from earlier times. This led to enormous losses. Soldiers died not only in combat, but also from disease, poor hygienic conditions, and inadequate medical care. Over time, the character of the war changed. Initially, Lincoln declared that his primary goal was to save the Union, not directly to abolish slavery. But the longer the war lasted, the clearer it became that slavery was the economic and social basis of the Confederacy. Enslaved people worked on plantations, grew food, built fortifications, and thus indirectly supported the war effort of the South. At the same time, many enslaved people fled to the lines of the Union, forcing the German government to take a practical stand. On January 1, 1863, Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation came into force. It declared the enslaved people in the rebellious areas of the Confederacy free. It did not immediately free all enslaved people, because it did not apply to slave states that had remained in the Union, and initially not to areas already controlled by Union troops. Nevertheless, it was a decisive turning point. The war now officially became a fight against slavery. In addition, black men could join the Union Army. Around 180,000 African American soldiers eventually served in the Union's armed forces. Their efforts refuted racist claims of courage, ability, and citizenship and made it clear that black people were actively involved in their own liberation. The year 1863 also brought military turning points. At Gettysburg in Pennsylvania, Lee's attempt to carry the war to the North failed. The battle lasted 3 days and became one of the bloodiest of the war. The defeat severely weakened the Confederation. Almost at the same time, the Union under General Ulysses S. Grant captured Vicksburg on the Mississippi River. The Union thus controlled the Mississippi River and divided the Confederacy geographically. These two victories marked a turning point in favor of the North. Lincoln later summed up the significance of the war in concise, forceful words in the Gettysburg Address. He presented the war as a test of whether a nation founded on freedom and popular rule could last in the long term. The fallen soldiers should not have died in vain. Their sacrifice was to give rise to a new birth of freedom. This speech became one of the most important texts in American history because it linked the Civil War to the ideals of the Declaration of Independence. In the last years of the war, the Union relied on a strategy of comprehensive exhaustion of the South. General Grant waged a fierce war of attrition against Lee in the East. General William Tecumseh Sherman moved his troops through Georgia and the Carolinas, destroying railroads, supplies, and infrastructure. His march to the sea was intended to break the Confederacy's ability and will to continue fighting. This meant enormous hardship for the civilian population of the South, but from the Union's point of view, it was intended to end the war more quickly. In April 1865, Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses South Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. The Civil War was practically decided. Only a few days later, Abraham Lincoln was shot at Ford's Theater in Washington by John Wilkes Booth, a Confederate sympathizer. Lincoln's death shocked the country. At the very moment when the nation was faced with the difficult task of shaping peace and reconstruction, it lost its most important political leader. The abolition of slavery was finally enshrined in 1865 by the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. This prohibited slavery in the United States, except as a punishment for a crime. This step was historically enormous. A system that had disenfranchised, exploited, and sold millions of people for centuries was legally ended. But legal freedom did not mean real equality. The formerly enslaved people were faced with the question of how to obtain land, work, education, political rights, and protection from violence. The Civil War cost the lives of hundreds of thousands of people and devastated large parts of the South. He saved the Union and ended slavery, but he did not resolve all conflicts. Racism, economic inequality, and the dispute over how to reintegrate the South into the Union remained. The central question after the war was, what does freedom really mean when people are no longer enslaved, but continue to live without property, without protection, and without equal rights? The next chapter is therefore about Reconstruction, i.e. Reconstruction after the Civil War, and the long struggle for civil rights. Chapter 10, Reconstruction and the Long Struggle for Civil Rights. When the American Civil War ended in 1865, slavery was officially abolished. But this was far from answering the central question, what should freedom mean in concrete terms for the formerly enslaved people? Did it just mean no longer being sold or considered property? Or did it also mean land, education, political rights, protection from violence, and real social equality? It was precisely these questions that revolved around the time of Reconstruction, i.e. Reconstruction after the Civil War. After the war, large parts of the South lay on the ground. Cities, plantations, railways, and fields were damaged. The economy was weakened, and many families mourned the loss of fallen relatives. The old order of plantation owners had been defeated militarily, but not completely disappeared. Many white Southerners wanted to return as quickly as possible to a society in which black people were no longer officially enslaved, but remained dependent, poor, and politically powerless. For the liberated people, on the other hand, the end of the war was a historic moment of hope. They looked for relatives who had been separated by sale, founded new families, built churches, demanded education, and wanted to be recognized as free citizens. Immediately after the war, the Freedmen's Bureau was established, a federal agency to help formerly enslaved people and poor whites in the South. It supported the construction of schools, arranged employment contracts, helped with legal issues, and in some cases, distributed food or medical care. Education in particular became a central concern. Many formerly enslaved people wanted to learn to read and write because they had often been forbidden to do so during slavery. Schools became symbols of freedom. Education meant not only knowledge, but also self-determination. But Reconstruction was politically contested from the beginning. Even before his death, President Abraham Lincoln had pursued a comparatively mild plan for the reintegration of the Southern states. After his assassination, Andrew Johnson took over the presidency. Johnson was from Tennessee and had been against secession, but had deeply racist views. He wanted to quickly reintegrate the Southern states into the Union and had many former Confederates return their political power. He had little interest in the liberated people. As a result, many Southern states issued so-called black codes. These laws were intended to severely restrict the freedom of black people. They regulated employment contracts, freedom of movement, property rights, and behavior in public spaces. Those who did not have an employment contract could be arrested as vagrants and forced to work. In this way, white elites tried to create a system that resembled slavery in a new form. Black people were no longer legally property, but they were to remain economically and socially dependent. In Congress, resistance to Johnson's policies therefore grew. The so-called radical Republicans in particular wanted to change the South more fundamentally. They were convinced that the former Confederates could not simply return to power, and that the rights of the freed people had to be protected by the federal government. This conflict gave rise to the phase of so-called Congressional Reconstruction, in which Congress took on a stronger role. During this time, 3 crucial constitutional amendments were passed. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment declared all people born or naturalized in the U.S. to be citizens and guaranteed them equal protection under the law. The 15th Amendment prohibited denying the right to vote on the basis of race, color, or previous enslavement. These amendments fundamentally changed the Constitution. For the first time, the federal government was explicitly obliged to protect civil rights against the individual states. For a short time, Reconstruction actually opened up new political possibilities. Black men were given the right to vote in many Southern states. They elected representatives, took part in constitutional conventions, and were themselves elected to public office. Hiram Revels of Mississippi became the first black senator in the United States in 1870. African American politicians also sat in the House of Representatives and in the legislatures of the Southern states. This development was a huge break for the former slave-owning society. People who had been considered property a few years earlier now helped shape laws and politics. During Reconstruction, new constitutions were created in the South that provided for public schools, civil rights, and more modern administrations. Many of these reforms benefited not only black people, but also poor whites. Nevertheless, this time was later often defamed by opponents. They claimed that Reconstruction governments were fundamentally corrupt and incompetent. Although there was corruption and political conflicts, as everywhere, this portrayal was strongly racist. It was intended to delegitimize the political participation of black people and justify the return of white supremacy. Violent resistance quickly formed against the progress of Reconstruction. The Ku Klux Klan and similar groups terrorized black citizens, white Republicans, teachers, clergy, and politicians. They wanted to prevent black people from voting, buying land, attending schools, or exercising political power. Intimidation, arson attacks, beatings, murder, and lynching were used to restore the old racist order. The federal government intervened at times and passed laws against the Klan. But the resistance was deeply rooted, and the political will in the North to permanently control the South militarily diminished over time. A central unsolved problem was the land question. Many liberated people hoped for their own land, because real independence was hardly possible without an economic basis. The expression 40 acres and a mule became a symbol of this hope. But a comprehensive distribution of land did not take place. Most of the land remained in the hands of white owners. Many black families therefore had to work as tenants or sharecroppers. In the case of sharecropping, they cultivated land of an owner and gave up part of the harvest. In practice, this system often led to debt, dependency, and poverty. It did not completely replace slavery, but it kept many people in economic bondage. In the 1870s, Reconstruction increasingly lost support. Many people in the North were tired of war and wanted to devote themselves to other issues, such as industrialization, economic crises, and Western expansion. At the same time, white Democrats in the South reorganized themselves. They often called themselves redeemers and claimed to liberate the South from alleged foreign rule and corruption. In fact, their return to power usually meant the restoration of white supremacy. The formal end of Reconstruction came in 1877. After the disputed presidential election of 1876, a political compromise was reached. Republican Rutherford B. Hayes became president, while in return the last federal troops were withdrawn from the South. As a result, black citizens in the South lost an important protection. The former Confederates and their successors were now able to consolidate their power with less and less resistance. In the decades that followed, the system of Jim Crow laws emerged. These laws enshrined racial segregation in public life, in schools, transportation, restaurants, parks, restrooms, hospitals, and many other areas. Officially, one spoke of separate but equal. In reality, facilities for black people were almost always poorly equipped and underfunded. Racial segregation was a system of humiliation and control. The right to vote was also systematically undermined. Although the 15th Amendment prohibited racial restrictions on voting rights, Southern states found ways to exclude black voters. They introduced voting taxes, reading tests, complicated registration rules, and so-called grandfather clauses that favored white voters. In addition, there was open violence. Anyone who wanted to vote as a black citizen risked losing their jobs, beatings, or even death. Thus, a large part of the African American population in the South was politically disenfranchised. The Supreme Court contributed to the consolidation of this order. The judgment of Plessy versus Ferguson of 1896 was particularly important. The court declared racial segregation to be constitutional as long as the separate institutions were supposedly equivalent. This ruling gave Jim Crow a legal basis and remained in place for decades. This severely damaged Reconstruction's hope for equal civil rights. But the fight for civil rights never stopped. Black communities built churches, schools, newspapers, associations, and political organizations. They preserved memory, strengthened solidarity, and developed strategies against oppression. Personalities such as Ida B. Wells courageously fought against lynching and made the violence public. Booker T. Washington focused on education, vocational training, and economic advancement, while W.E.B. Du Bois called for stronger political rights, higher education, and immediate equality. These different approaches showed how difficult the situation was and how diverse the resistance remained. In the early 20th century, new organizations emerged, including the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, in 1909. She fought legally, politically, and publicly against discrimination. The struggle for civil rights was thus institutionalized more strongly. At the same time, many black people left the South as part of the Great Migration and moved to cities in the North and West. They were looking for work, security, and better opportunities. But even there they encountered racism, residential segregation, and violence. Nevertheless, this migration profoundly changed the political and cultural landscape of the USA. Reconstruction was therefore a time of great opportunity and great defeat. It brought the abolition of slavery, constitutional rights, and at times political participation of black citizens. At the same time, it failed to permanently protect these rights and create economic justice. The end of Reconstruction did not lead back to slavery, but to a new system of racial control. The long struggle for civil rights, which gained new strength in the 20th century with the civil rights movement, had its roots precisely in this time. The questions that remained unanswered after the Civil War accompanied the USA for generations. Who gets to vote? Who receives protection from the law? Who really belongs to the nation? And how can a country promise freedom if it denies equal rights to part of its population? The next chapter deals with industrialization, immigration, and the rise of the USA to economic power. While the South struggled with the consequences of war and Reconstruction, factories, railways, cities, and millions of immigrants transformed the country into a modern industrial nation. Chapter 11: Industrialization, Immigration, and Rise to Economic Power. After the Civil War, the United States changed at an enormous pace. A country that had long been strongly influenced by agriculture, regional markets, and Western expansion, became one of the most powerful industrial nations in the world within a few decades. Factories, railways, steel mills, mines, banks, and large cities changed the face of the country. This period brought prosperity, technical innovations, and new opportunities, but also poverty, exploitation, social conflicts, and extreme inequality. A central symbol of this development was the railway. The expansion of railway lines had already begun before the Civil War, but after 1865 it accelerated sharply. Railways connected cities, ports, raw material areas, and agricultural regions. They made it possible to transport goods faster and cheaper over long distances. Grain from the Midwest could reach the East Coast, coal and iron could be taken to factories, and industrial products could reach new markets. The railway was not only a means of transport, but an engine of the national economy. Particularly significant was the first transcontinental railroad, completed in 1869. It connected the east of the USA with the west and drastically shortened journeys across the continent. What could previously take months was now possible in a few days. For many Americans, this connection became a symbol of national unity and technical progress. But here, too, progress had a dark side. Railway construction was often carried out under harsh and dangerous working conditions. Chinese workers in particular played a decisive role in construction in the West, but were poorly paid, discriminated against, and later excluded by racist laws. The railway also accelerated the further development of the West. Settlers, traders, soldiers, and entrepreneurs were able to penetrate more quickly into areas that had previously been difficult to reach. For indigenous peoples, this meant new pressure. Railway lines cut through hunting grounds, brought streams of settlers with them, and destroyed livelihoods. Especially the bison herds of the Great Plains were massively decimated. For many Plains peoples, whose lives were closely linked to the bison, this was a disaster. The economic progress of the USA thus continued to be accompanied by violence and repression. In addition to the railway, steel, coal, and oil became key industries. Steel was necessary for rails, bridges, machinery, buildings, and weapons. Andrew Carnegie built a huge steel empire and became one of the richest men of his time. John D. Rockefeller dominated the oil industry with Standard Oil. J.P. Morgan played a central role in banking and in the financing of large companies. These men were admired by some as ingenious entrepreneurs, criticized by others as robber barons. The term made it clear that their wealth came not only from innovation and organization, but also from harsh business methods, monopolies, low wages, and political influence. During this time, large corporations, trusts, and monopolies emerged. Companies became larger and larger and controlled entire markets. Through vertical integration, companies took over different stages of production, from the raw material to the finished product. Through horizontal integration, they bought up competitors or forced them out of the market. This allowed them to control prices and make huge profits. For consumers and smaller businesses, this power has often been problematic. Many people began to question whether democracy could still function if individual entrepreneurs became more economically powerful than entire states. Industrialization also changed the world of work. Millions of people worked in factories, mines, slaughterhouses, textile factories, and steel mills. The working days were long, often 10 to 12 hours or more. Safety regulations were weak, accidents were frequent, and wages were low. Child labor was widespread in many industries. Workers had little protection if they became ill, injured, or lost their jobs. While entrepreneurs amassed huge fortunes, many employees lived in poverty. At the same time, the cities grew rapidly. New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, Boston, Pittsburgh, St. Louis, and many other cities became centers of industry, commerce, and immigration. Factories attracted people looking for work. New districts, tenements, trams, department stores, and entertainment venues sprang up in the cities. City life was dynamic and diverse, but also cramped, loud and dangerous. Many working-class families lived in overcrowded apartments without adequate sanitation. Disease could spread quickly, and fires were a constant danger. A crucial part of this development was immigration. Between the late 19th and early 20th centuries, millions of people came to the United States. Many initially came from Ireland, Germany, Scandinavia, and Great Britain. Later, more and more immigrants came from Southern and Eastern Europe, including Italians, Poles, Russians, Greeks, Hungarians, and Jewish refugees from the Tsarist Empire. They fled poverty, hunger, political oppression, religious persecution, or simply sought better opportunities. For many, America became a symbol of hope. However, arriving in the USA was often hard. Ellis Island in New York Harbor became the gateway to the New World for millions of people. There, immigrants were registered and medically examined. Those who were admitted usually began a difficult new life. Many found work in factories, on construction sites, in households or small shops. Language barriers, low wages, poor housing conditions, and discrimination shaped everyday life. Nevertheless, immigrants built communities, founded churches, synagogues, associations, newspapers, and shops. They had a profound impact on the culture of American cities. Not all immigrants were treated equally. While European immigrants were often subject to prejudice, many of their descendants were able to be accepted as white over time and move up the social ladder. People from Asia, on the other hand, encountered particularly harsh exclusion. Chinese workers had been important in railway construction and other areas, but were increasingly seen as competition. In 1882, the U.S. passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which severely restricted Chinese immigration. It was one of the first major federal laws to explicitly limit immigration by origin and ethnicity. It shows that the image of the USA as an open immigration country has always been accompanied by racism and exclusion. The social inequality of industrialization led to growing protest. Workers began to organize themselves in trade unions. They demanded better wages, shorter working hours, safer working conditions, and the right to negotiate together. One of the early large organizations was the Knights of Labor, which wanted to build a broad labor movement. Later, the American Federation of Labor under Samuel Gompers became influential. It focused more on skilled workers and concrete improvements such as higher wages and shorter working hours. The conflicts between workers and employers were often fierce. Strikes were often met with violence. In the Haymarket incident in Chicago in 1886, a workers' rally became a national shock event after a bomb explosion and gunfire. The 1892 Homestead strike against Carnegie Steel Company ended in violence between strikers and private security guards. The Pullman strike of 1894 paralyzed large parts of the railway traffic and was ended by federal troops. These events show how tense the relationship between capital and labor was. The government often sided with the companies rather than the workers. There was also dissatisfaction in the countryside. Farmers suffered from fluctuating prices, high transportation costs, debt, and the power of railroads and banks. Many joined protest movements, first in farmer alliances and later in the Populist Party. The Populists demanded, among other things, stronger regulation of the railways, reform of the monetary system, direct democratic elements, and more political power for ordinary citizens. Although they were not permanently successful nationally, their ideas influenced later reform movements. The post-Civil War period is often referred to as the Gilded Age. The expression comes from Mark Twain and means that the surface was shiny, but underneath there were big problems. To the outside world, the USA appeared rich, modern, and successful. Skyscrapers were built, businesses expanded, technical inventions changed everyday life, and some people lived in incredible luxury. At the same time, millions struggled with poverty, insecurity, and a lack of political participation. Corruption was widespread, political machines controlled many cities, and corporations exerted strong influence on parties and laws. Despite these problems, industrialization was a decisive step in the rise of the United States as a world power. The enormous production of steel, coal, oil, machinery, and consumer goods made the country economically stronger and stronger. The large domestic market, the many raw materials, the growing population, and the entrepreneurial spirit drove the development forward. By the end of the 19th century, the USA had overtaken Great Britain industrially in some areas. A former colonial society had become an economic giant. The country also changed culturally. New media, mass newspapers, advertising, department stores, and leisure activities shaped everyday life. Electric lights, telephones, elevators, and trams changed cities and working lives. Inventors such as Thomas Edison became symbolic figures of progress. At the same time, new debates arose about what America should be: a country of unlimited economic freedom or a country in which the state had to ensure social justice and fair rules. This question led to the progressive era at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century, a reform movement that wanted to fight corruption, regulate companies, improve working conditions, and renew democracy. But before these reforms became stronger, the U.S. was already beginning to look beyond its own continent. Economic strength, military self-confidence, and the desire for new markets led to a more active foreign policy. The next chapter is about how the United States became a world power, through imperialism, the Spanish-American War, influence in Latin America and the Pacific, and finally through its entry into World War I. Chapter 12: The USA as a World Power, Imperialism and World War I. By the end of the 19th century, the United States had changed fundamentally. A young republic on the Atlantic coast had become a huge continental state that stretched from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Industrialization had made the country one of the strongest economic powers in the world. Factories produced steel, machinery, textiles, food, and consumer goods in huge quantities. Railways connected regions, banks financed companies, and large corporations looked for new markets. With this economic strength, political and military self-confidence also grew. More and more politicians, businessmen, and military officers were convinced that the USA should play a greater role not only on their own continent, but worldwide. This new attitude was in tension with the older American tradition. For a long time, many U.S. politicians had stressed that the country should stay out of European power struggles. George Washington had already warned against lasting alliances. The Monroe Doctrine of 1823 was also originally directed primarily against European interference in America. The U.S. wanted to prevent European powers from establishing new colonies in the Western Hemisphere or regaining control of independent Latin American states. In the course of the 19th century, however, this doctrine was increasingly interpreted differently. Not only was Europe to stay out of America, but the USA itself claimed a leading role in the Western Hemisphere. Several factors drove this change. Economically, American companies were looking for new sales markets and investment opportunities. If domestic production continued to grow, goods would also have to be sold abroad. Strategically, military planners called for a stronger navy and bases overseas. Of particular influence was naval officer Alfred Thayer Mahan, who argued that great powers needed strong fleets and control points on the world's oceans. Anyone who wants to trade and exert influence must be able to secure sea routes. Such ideas fit into a time when European powers possessed large colonial empires and imperialism reached its peak worldwide. Ideological ideas also played an important role. Many Americans believed that their country had a special mission. This idea tied in with the older Manifest Destiny, but has now been expanded beyond the continent. The USA was supposed to bring freedom, progress, Christianity, and civilization to other regions. Such arguments sounded idealistic, but were often associated with racism and power interests. Many proponents of imperialism regarded other peoples as backward and believed that the U.S. had the right, or even the duty, to rule over them. Critics saw this as a betrayal of their own republican ideals. How could a country that had emerged from an anti-colonial struggle for independence dominate colonies itself? The decisive breakthrough to imperial power came in 1898 with the Spanish-American War. The starting point was the situation in Cuba, which was still under Spanish rule at the time. Cuban independence fighters rebelled against Spain, and the Spanish reaction was brutal. American newspapers reported extensively and often sensationally on violence and suffering on the island. This so-called yellow press fueled outrage among the U.S. population. Publishers such as William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer in particular relied on dramatic headlines and emotional reports. This increased the pressure on the government to intervene. An immediate trigger was the explosion of the American warship USS Maine in the harbor of Havana in February 1898. The cause was unclear at the time, but many newspapers and politicians blamed Spain. The slogan "Remember the Maine" became a battle cry. In April 1898, the USA declared war on Spain. The war lasted only a few months and ended with a clear American victory. Spain was a weakened colonial power, while the U.S. was able to use its modern navy and economic strength. The consequences of the war were enormous. Cuba became formally independent, but came under strong American influence. Through the Platt Amendment, the U.S. later secured far-reaching rights of intervention in Cuban affairs and received, among other things, the Guantanamo Bay Naval Base. Puerto Rico became American territory. Guam also fell to the USA. The takeover of the Philippines was particularly controversial. Many Filipinos had fought for independence against Spain and now expected freedom. Instead, the U.S. took control. This resulted in the Philippine-American War, a brutal conflict in which American troops fought against Filipino independence fighters. For the opponents of imperialism, this was clear evidence that the U.S. had begun to act in a similar way to the European colonial powers. Within the USA, this development triggered a fierce debate. Proponents saw overseas territories as a sign of national greatness, as strategic bases, and as an economic opportunity. Opponents, including members of the Anti-Imperialist League, argued that colonial rule contradicted the Declaration of Independence and the principle of self-determination. Critics included well-known personalities such as Mark Twain and Andrew Carnegie. They warned that a republic loses its soul if it governs other peoples without their consent. Nevertheless, the imperialist tendency largely prevailed politically. The U.S. also expanded its influence in the Pacific. Hawaii played a special role in this. American missionaries, traders, and plantation owners had already gained great influence there in the 19th century. Sugar plantations were economically important, and many American entrepreneurs wanted a closer connection to the United States. In 1893, the Hawaiian Queen Liliuokalani was overthrown with the support of American interests. In 1898, the USA officially annexed Hawaii. The archipelago became an important strategic base in the Pacific and later a federal state. For the native Hawaiian population, however, this development meant the loss of political self-determination. In Latin America, the U.S. increasingly pursued a policy often referred to as big stick diplomacy. President Theodore Roosevelt in particular shaped this attitude. His motto was, "Speak softly, but carry a big stick." The U.S. should act diplomatically, but have military power ready. A central example was Panama. The USA wanted to build a canal that would connect the Atlantic and Pacific and make maritime trade and naval movements much easier. When negotiations with Colombia, to which Panama belonged at the time, became difficult, the USA supported Panama's independence in 1903. Shortly thereafter, they gained control of the Canal Zone. The Panama Canal was opened in 1914 and was a gigantic technical and strategic project. Roosevelt also formulated the Roosevelt Amendment to the Monroe Doctrine. According to this, the U.S. claimed the right to intervene in Latin American states if it feared instability, debt problems, or European interference. In practice, this led to repeated interventions in countries such as the Dominican Republic, Nicaragua, Haiti, and Cuba. The United States presented itself as a force for order, but often acted in favor of its own economic and strategic interests. These interventions had a lasting impact on the relationship between the USA and Latin America and generated mistrust that continues to have an effect today. While the United States became more active in the Western Hemisphere and the Pacific, World War I broke out in Europe in 1914. At first, the United States tried to remain neutral. Many Americans did not want to be drawn into European conflicts. The country was also ethnically diverse. Millions of citizens had German, Irish, British, Eastern European, or other roots, and their sympathies were not uniform. President Woodrow Wilson declared neutrality and even won re-election in 1916 with a promise to have kept the United States out of the war. But neutrality became increasingly difficult. Economically, the USA was closely linked to the Allies, especially Great Britain and France. American banks granted loans. American companies supplied goods and war material. At the same time, Germany waged a submarine war against ships supplying Great Britain. In 1915, a German submarine sank the Lusitania, a British passenger ship on which American citizens also died. The event outraged the American public, but did not immediately lead to entry into the war. The decisive turning point came in 1917, when Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare and thus attacked ships that affected American interests. In addition, the Zimmermann Telegram became known. In it, Germany proposed an alliance to Mexico against the United States and held out the prospect of territorial gains if the United States entered the war. For many Americans, this was evidence of German hostility. In April 1917, President Wilson asked Congress for a declaration of war against Germany. He justified the entry with the goal of making the world safe for democracy. The entry of the USA into the war changed the course of the First World War. Although American troops did not arrive at the front in large numbers until 1918, their fresh soldiers, economic resources, and moral impact strengthened the Allies considerably. The American Expeditionary Forces under General John J. Pershing fought on the Western Front, helping to halt the German Spring Offensive and allow the Allies to counterattack. In November 1918, Germany asked for an armistice. For the USA, the war was a turning point. For the first time, they had sent troops to Europe on a large scale and actively intervened in a global conflict. President Wilson then tried to create a new international order. In his 14 points, he demanded, among other things, open diplomacy, self-determination of peoples, free trade, disarmament, and the establishment of a League of Nations. Wilson wanted to prevent such a war from happening again. But his vision met with resistance. At the peace negotiations in Versailles, France and Great Britain also relied on punishment and security interests vis-a-vis Germany. The Treaty of Versailles contained the League of Nations, but also harsh conditions for Germany. In the USA itself, the Senate rejected joining the League of Nations. Many politicians did not want to enter into permanent international obligations. Although the country had achieved world power status, it was still inwardly unsure what role it wanted to play in the long term. The years around 1900 to 1918 show the transition of the United States from a continental power to a global power. The USA acquired overseas territories, expanded its navy, intervened in Latin America, controlled strategic bases, and finally helped decide the outcome of the First World War. In doing so, they combined ideals such as freedom and democracy with economic interests, military power, and imperial practices. These contradictions were to shape American foreign policy in the 20th century as well. The United States often saw itself as a defender of freedom and order, but often acted in a power-political and self-serving manner. After the First World War, they partially withdrew politically, but remained a central economic force. In the 1920s, the country experienced a seemingly limitless boom, cultural change, and new mass culture. But beneath the shiny surface, risks grew, which became visible in 1929 in one of the greatest economic crises in history. The next chapter is therefore about the Roaring Twenties, the Great Depression, and the New Deal. Chapter 13, The Roaring Twenties, Great Depression, and New Deal. After the end of World War I, the United States was at a turning point. The country was economically stronger than ever before, had not experienced the war on its own soil, and was now one of the most important creditor states in the world. While large parts of Europe were destroyed, American factories continued to produce, banks granted loans, companies expanded, and many people were optimistic about the future. The 1920s were therefore often referred to later as the Golden Twenties. They were a time of economic boom, cultural changes, and technical innovations. But behind the glamour of those years lay dangerous tensions that ultimately led to the worst economic crisis in modern American history. A central symbol of the 1920s was the car. Henry Ford in particular changed the industry with his assembly line production. The Model T became affordable for many Americans and made individual mobility possible. Cars not only changed traffic, but also everyday life. People were able to live further away, go on excursions, and develop new consumption habits. At the same time, new industries emerged: gas stations, road construction, workshops, motels, and suburbs grew. The car became a symbol of modern freedom. Other consumer goods also spread. Radios, refrigerators, washing machines, vacuum cleaners, and telephones found their way into more and more households. Advertising became more professional and seduced people to buy not only what they needed, but what promised them a modern attitude to life. Department stores, catalogs, and installment payments made consumption more accessible. Many Americans began to buy goods on credit. The belief in lasting progress was strong. Those who consumed showed that they were part of modern society. Radio became one of the most important mass media. For the first time, millions of people were able to listen to the same news, sporting events, music broadcasts, and advertising messages at the same time. This created a common popular culture. Cinema also gained enormously in importance. Hollywood became the center of the film industry and produced stars, dreams, and images that had an impact far beyond the USA. With the advent of sound film towards the end of the 1920s, cinema became even more influential. The USA began to shape the world culturally. The 1920s were also a time of social change, especially in the cities. Young women, the so-called flappers, became a symbol of a new attitude to life. They wore shorter dresses, cut their hair short, went dancing, smoked in public, and questioned traditional notions of femininity. Of course, not all women lived like this, and many of these images were more urban and fashionable. Nevertheless, there was a change. Women had been given the right to vote in 1920 with the 19th Amendment, and many demanded more independence in work, education, and everyday life. The Harlem Renaissance was particularly culturally significant. In Harlem, a district of New York, a flowering of African American art, literature, and music emerged. Writers such as Langston Hughes, artists, intellectuals, and musicians created a new self-awareness of black culture. Jazz became one of the most important musical forms of expression of the time. It grew out of African American traditions and spread across the country through clubs, records, and radio. For many, jazz stood for freedom, improvisation, and modernity. For conservative critics, on the other hand, it was a sign of moral decay. This is precisely how strongly the 1920s were marked by cultural conflicts. Because the Golden Twenties were by no means golden for everyone. While cities grew and consumption increased, many rural regions were left behind. Farmers suffered from falling prices and debts after the First World War. During the war, they had produced a lot, but after the end of the war, demand fell. Many had taken out loans to buy land or machinery and were now in trouble. Workers did not always benefit from the boom either. Wages often rose more slowly than corporate profits, and many jobs remained uncertain. In addition, there were strong social and political tensions. After the Russian Revolution of 1917, many Americans feared communism. In the so-called Red Scare, the fear of the Red Revolution, radical groups, trade unionists, socialists, anarchists, and immigrants were suspected of wanting to destroy the USA. Raids, arrests, and deportations showed how quickly civil liberties could be restricted when fear determined politics. Xenophobia also increased. In the 1920s, immigration laws were tightened, especially against people from Southern and Eastern Europe as well as Asians. Many white Protestants feared that the country was changing too much. The Ku Klux Klan experienced a new heyday. It was directed not only against black people, but also against Catholics, Jews, immigrants, and anyone who did not fit into his image of a white, Protestant America. Millions of people were members or supporters at times. This shows that modernity and reaction stood side by side in the 1920s. Another major conflict was Prohibition. Since 1920, the production and sale of alcohol was prohibited by the 18th Amendment to the Constitution. Proponents believed that alcohol was the cause of poverty, violence, and moral decay. But the ban did not lead to an alcohol-free society. Instead, illegal bars, smuggling networks, and organized crime emerged. Gangsters like Al Capone became symbolic figures of this time. Prohibition showed how difficult it was to enforce moral ideas by law against broad social customs. It was finally abolished in 1933. While many people believed in the upswing, a dangerous speculative bubble grew on the stock market. More and more Americans are buying stocks, often on credit. They hoped that prices would continue to rise and enable quick profits. Banks, companies, and private investors were intertwined. At the same time, the economy was less stable than it seemed. The purchasing power of many people was limited, agriculture was in crisis, incomes were unevenly distributed, and companies sometimes produced more than could be sold. In October 1929, the stock market collapsed. The crash on Wall Street marked the beginning of the Great Depression. Stock prices plummeted, assets disappeared, banks got into trouble, companies laid off workers or closed down altogether. The crisis spread rapidly. People lost their savings, their homes, their jobs, and their hope. Since many banks collapsed, people who had never speculated also lost money. The economic hardship became a national catastrophe. President Herbert Hoover initially believed that the economy would largely recover on its own. He relied on voluntary cooperation between companies, charity, and limited government measures. But the crisis got worse and worse. By the early 1930s, millions of people were unemployed. Soup kitchens, homeless settlements, and long queues in front of aid centers became everyday life. Settlements of makeshift huts were derisively called Hoovervilles because many blamed Hoovers for the misery. The situation was particularly dramatic in the Great Plains. There, an environmental disaster was added to the economic crisis: the Dust Bowl. Drought, incorrect cultivation methods, and strong winds led to fertile soil blowing away. Dust storms darkened the sky, destroyed farms, and made entire regions barely inhabitable. Many farming families left Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, and other states and moved west, especially to California. They hoped for work, but often found poverty and rejection. In 1932, Franklin D. Roosevelt was elected president. He promised a New Deal for the American people. By this he meant a new political response to the crisis. Unlike Hoover, Roosevelt was convinced that the state must actively intervene to stabilize banks, create jobs, alleviate poverty, and restore confidence. When he took office in 1933, he gave his famous inaugural speech, in which he declared that the only thing to fear is fear itself. These words were intended to give courage and the impression that leadership and action were possible. The New Deal consisted of many programs and reforms, not a single law. The first step was to stabilize the banking system. Banks were temporarily closed and inspected. Only solid banks were allowed to reopen. In addition, a deposit insurance scheme was created so that people could regain confidence in their bank deposits. The government regulated the stock market more closely to curb excessive speculation. Another focus was work. Programs such as the Works Progress Administration and the Civilian Conservation Corps created millions of jobs. People built roads, bridges, schools, parks, airports, and public buildings. Young men worked in conservation projects, planted trees, built trails, and improved national parks. These programs gave not only income, but also dignity. Those who worked felt less like victims of the crisis. Agriculture was also supported. The government tried to stabilize prices, control production, and relieve farmers. Some measures were controversial, such as when farmers were paid to grow less while other people suffered from hunger. Nevertheless, a new idea emerged. The German government took responsibility for economic stability and social security. The Social Security Act of 1935 was particularly durable. He laid the foundations for pensions, unemployment insurance, and support for certain needy groups. This created an important building block of the American welfare state. Many groups were initially excluded or disadvantaged, including many agricultural workers and domestic workers, which particularly affected black workers. Nevertheless, Social Security was a fundamental change. The state recognized that citizens in old age, unemployment, or need could be entitled to support. The New Deal also changed the relationship between citizens and the federal government. Previously, many Americans had been skeptical of a strong central government. Now more and more people expect Washington to take responsibility for the economy, labor, and Social Security. Roosevelt used the radio to speak directly to the population. His fireside chats explained politics in understandable language and strengthened the trust of many citizens. However, the New Deal had its limits. It did not completely end the Great Depression. Only the massive armaments production before and during the Second World War finally brought full employment. Moreover, the New Deal did not eliminate racism or inequality. In order to retain the support of Southern Democrats in Congress, Roosevelt often avoided direct attacks on racial segregation. Many programs were implemented in a locally discriminatory manner. While women were given new opportunities, they were still often pushed into traditional roles. Nevertheless, the New Deal was a turning point. He did not save capitalism by abolishing it, but by reforming it. He showed that democracy could be able to act even in a serious crisis. While dictatorships grew stronger in Europe, American democracy remained, even when it was under pressure. The state regulated markets more strictly, created Social Security, and invested in public works. The years from 1920 to the New Deal show two sides of American modernity. The 1920s stood for consumption, jazz, cinema, cars, and seemingly limitless progress. The 1930s showed how fragile this prosperity was and how deeply a crisis could shake a society. However, the collapse also gave rise to a new idea of the responsibility of the state towards its citizens. The next chapter deals with the Second World War, the rise of the USA as a superpower, the Cold War, and the profound social changes of the post-war period. Chapter 14, World War II, Cold War and Social Change. When the Great Depression shook the United States, many Americans initially turned their gaze inward. Unemployment, poverty, and the reforms of the New Deal dominated the political debate. But while the U.S. struggled with its own problems, the world situation changed dramatically. In Europe, Adolf Hitler rose to power in Germany, Italy was ruled by fascists under Mussolini, and in Asia, Japan pursued an aggressive expansionist policy. Many Americans did not want to be drawn into a European or Asian war again after the experiences of the First World War. Isolationist sentiments were strong. But step by step, it became clear that the U.S. could not stay away from global conflicts permanently. World War II began in Europe in 1939 with the German attack on Poland. Great Britain and France then declared war on Germany. The USA initially remained officially neutral, but increasingly supported Great Britain and later also the Soviet Union with weapons, material, and loans. President Franklin D. Roosevelt was convinced that an Axis victory would pose a threat to the entire world. With the Lend-Lease program, the USA supplied war material to states that fought against Germany and its allies. The USA thus became the arsenal of democracy, the armory of democracy, even before it officially entered the war itself. The decisive turning point came on December 7, 1941, when Japan unexpectedly attacked the American naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. Numerous ships were damaged or sunk. Over 2,000 American soldiers died. The attack shocked the American public. The next day, Congress declared war on Japan. Shortly afterwards, Germany and Italy declared war on the USA. Thus, the United States was finally part of the Second World War. The war changed American society in a very short time. Factories switched their production to tanks, planes, ships, weapons, and ammunition. Millions of men were drafted. Millions of women worked in industrial plants, offices, and military auxiliary services. The image of Rosie the Riveter, a strong female worker in the arms industry, became a symbol of female contributions to the war. For many women, this time meant new work opportunities and a new self-confidence. After the war, however, many were pushed back into traditional roles. African Americans also fought and worked for victory, even though they continued to experience discrimination and racial segregation in their own country. Many supported the so-called Double V campaign, victory against fascism abroad and victory against racism at home. Black soldiers often served in separate units and were treated worse than white soldiers. Nevertheless, they made significant contributions, such as the Tuskegee Airmen, African American fighter pilots who distinguished themselves by special achievements. The contradiction between the struggle for freedom in Europe and inequality in the U.S. became more and more obvious. One of the darkest domestic policies of the war was the internment of Japanese Americans. After Pearl Harbor, over 100,000 people of Japanese origin, many of them American citizens, were forcibly sent to camps. The government justified this with security concerns, but in fact the measure was heavily based on racism, fear, and prejudice. Those affected lost homes, businesses, and freedom without being proven to be individually guilty. It was not until decades later that the U.S. government officially apologized and paid compensation. Militarily, the U.S. fought on two major fronts, against Germany and Italy in Europe and North Africa, and against Japan in the Pacific. In Europe, American and British troops landed first in North Africa, later in Italy. The decisive step towards the liberation of Western Europe was D-Day on June 6, 1944, when Allied troops landed in Normandy and opened a second front against Germany. American, British, Canadian, and other Allied troops advanced from the west, while the Soviet Union pushed Germany back from the east. In May 1945, Germany capitulated. In the Pacific, the war was particularly brutal. The USA fought its way closer to Japan island by island. Battles such as Midway, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa became symbols of extreme severity. President Harry S. Truman, who had taken office after Roosevelt's death in April 1945, was finally faced with a decision of whether to use the newly developed atomic bomb. In August 1945, the U.S. dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Tens of thousands of people died immediately, many more later from injuries and radiation. Shortly afterwards, Japan capitulated. To this day, the use of atomic bombs is controversially discussed. Some argue that it ended the war more quickly and prevented an invasion. Others see it as a morally hardly justifiable destruction of civilian cities. After 1945, the USA was more powerful than ever before. Europe and large parts of Asia were destroyed, while the American economy was strong. The U.S. had enormous industrial capacity, a powerful army, nuclear weapons, and global influence. Together with the Soviet Union, they were now one of two superpowers. But the war alliance quickly turned into rivalry. The Cold War began. The Cold War was not a direct war between the USA and the Soviet Union, but a global power and systemic conflict. The USA stood for capitalism, liberal democracy, and Western alliances. The Soviet Union stood for communist one-party rule and a socialist planned economy. Both sides deeply mistrusted each other. In Europe, the continent was divided into a Western and an Eastern bloc. Germany was divided, Berlin became a focal point, and the Iron Curtain separated East and West. the U.S. developed a policy of containment. The aim was to prevent the spread of communism. With the Marshall Plan, they provided economic support for the reconstruction of Western Europe. This aid stabilized democracies, strengthened markets, and tied Western Europe more closely to the USA. In 1949, NATO was founded, a military alliance of Western states. The Soviet Union later reacted with the Warsaw Pact. The world was increasingly divided into alliance systems. The Cold War also led to military conflicts. In the Korean War from 1950 to 1953, the USA and its allies fought under a UN mandate against North Korean and later Chinese troops. The war ended without a clear winner. Korea remained divided. Later, the Vietnam War became even more consequential. The U.S. supported South Vietnam against Communist North Vietnam, and the Viet Cong advisors became more and more soldiers. In the 1960s, the war escalated massively. Millions of Vietnamese died, including tens of thousands of American soldiers. The war deeply divided American society. Many people protested against conscription, bombing, and the credibility of the government. The Cold War also shaped the USA internally. The fear of communist infiltration led to mistrust, investigations, and persecution. Senator Joseph McCarthy in particular became a symbol of this anti-communist hysteria. People from politics, the film industry, science, and administration were suspected, interrogated, or professionally destroyed. Although there were real espionage cases, the McCarthy era showed how fear can endanger civil liberties. At the same time, the USA experienced an enormous economic upswing after 1945. Millions of veterans benefited from the GI Bill, which supported education, study, and home purchases. Suburbs grew, highways were built, consumer goods such as televisions, cars, and household appliances became the everyday life of many families. The white middle class expanded. But this prosperity was unevenly distributed. Many Black Americans, Latinos, indigenous people, and other minorities have been excluded from advancement or systematically disadvantaged, for example through discriminatory lending, housing segregation, and poorer schools. Out of this contradiction arose the modern civil rights movement. Already during and after the Second World War, the pressure against racial segregation had grown. In 1954, the Supreme Court ruled in Brown v. Board of Education that racial segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. This ruling attacked the basis of Jim Crow, but its implementation met with massive resistance in the South. In 1955, Rosa Parks was arrested in Montgomery, Alabama, for not giving up her seat on the bus for a white passenger. The following bus boycott made Martin Luther King Jr. nationally famous. The civil rights movement relied on boycotts, demonstrations, sit-ins, freedom rides, and nonviolent resistance. Activists risked arrest, beatings, and murder. Images of police violence against peaceful demonstrators shocked the public. In 1963, Martin Luther King gave his famous speech at the March on Washington, in which he dreamed of a future in which people would not be judged by the color of their skin, but by their character. The movement was instrumental in the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibited discrimination in public institutions and in the workplace, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which strengthened the protection of the right to vote. But the 1960s were not only marked by civil rights. Women demanded equal rights in work, education, family, and politics. The modern women's movement criticized traditional role models and legal discrimination. Students protested against war, racism, and authoritarian structures. The counterculture questioned consumer society, sexual morality, and political institutions. Indigenous activists, Chicano movements, the LGBTQ movement, and other groups also fought more visibly for rights and recognition. This time brought great progress, but also violence and shock. President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in 1963, Malcolm X in 1965, Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy in 1968. The Watergate scandal in the early 1970s, which led to the resignation of President Richard Nixon, further exacerbated this crisis of confidence. The Cold War remained decisive in foreign policy. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 brought the world to the brink of nuclear war, when the Soviet Union stationed nuclear missiles in Cuba and the U.S. imposed a naval blockade. After dramatic days, both sides found a compromise. The crisis showed how dangerous the nuclear confrontation was. Later, there was a policy of détente, arms control treaties, and diplomatic openings, for example with China under Nixon. But the rivalry remained. By the 1970s, the USA had changed profoundly. They were superpowers, consumer society, military giants, and cultural centers. At the same time, they were a country of internal conflicts, about racism, war, gender roles, poverty, political power, and the limits of state authority. The Second World War had made the USA the leading power of the West. The Cold War forced them to exercise responsibility and influence worldwide. The social movements within the country reminded the country that freedom had to be defended not only in the struggle against external opponents, but also in one's own everyday life. The next chapter is about the USA from the 1980s to the present day: conservative change, globalization, the end of the Cold War, 9/11, wars in the Middle East, digitalization, political polarization, and the challenges of the present. Now write Chapter 15 as a fluent text with about 1,000 words without pictures. I now conclude the script with a contemporary chapter and keep the style of the previous chapters: narrative, coherent, and without pictorial elements. Chapter 15: The USA from the 1980s to the present. Since the 1980s, the United States has changed a lot again. After the crises of the 1960s and 1970s, the Vietnam War, Watergate, oil crises, inflation, and social conflicts, many Americans longed for stability, strength, and new national self-confidence. It was precisely in this mood that Ronald Reagan was elected president in 1980. He promised to make America more optimistic, economically dynamic, and internationally determined again. His presidency marked a conservative turning point in American history. Reagan relied on tax cuts, deregulation, and a reduction in the state's influence on the economy. His supporters believed that lower taxes on corporations and the wealthy would encourage investment, create jobs, and ultimately benefit everyone. Critics accused this policy of increasing social inequality and burdening the national budget with high military spending and lower revenues. In fact, the 1980s became a time of economic renewal, but also of growing differences between rich and poor. In foreign policy, the Cold War continued to be the focus. Reagan was initially very tough on the Soviet Union. He increased arms spending, spoke of communism as a threat, and wanted to expand the military strength of the USA. At the same time, the political situation in the Soviet Union changed under Mikhail Gorbachev. Reforms such as glasnost and perestroika were intended to modernize the Soviet system, but at the same time weakened it. In the second half of the 1980s, disarmament negotiations took place between the USA and the Soviet Union. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell, and in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. The Cold War was over. For the United States, the end of the Cold War meant a historic triumph. They now seemed to be the only superpower. Many believed that democracy, the market economy, and American influence had finally prevailed. In the 1990s, especially under President Bill Clinton, the U.S. experienced economic growth, technological innovation, and increasing globalization. The computer, the internet, and new forms of communication changed the economy, work, and everyday life. Silicon Valley companies have become symbols of a new digital future. At the same time, globalization brought new uncertainties. Companies relocated production abroad because it was cheaper to work there. Many industrial workers, especially in the so-called Rust Belt, lost well-paid jobs. While some Americans benefited from technology, financial markets, and global trade, others felt left behind. Entire regions that used to live on steel, cars, or coal came under pressure. These economic shifts were later to have political consequences. The 1990s were also not free of conflicts. Domestically, Democrats and Republicans argued increasingly fiercely over taxes, social policy, health care, gun rights, abortion, and the role of the state. Clinton's presidency ended with impeachment, which did not lead to his removal, but showed how strong partisan antagonisms had become. The political culture became more confrontational. A dramatic turning point came on September 11, 2001, when terrorists from the Al-Qaeda network hijacked 4 planes. 2 were steered into the World Trade Center in New York, 1 into the Pentagon near Washington, and a 4th crashed after resistance from passengers in Pennsylvania. Almost 3,000 people died. The attacks traumatized the U.S. and fundamentally changed its policy. President George W. Bush declared the war on terror. First, the U.S. attacked Afghanistan because Al-Qaeda had been protected by the Taliban there. The Iraq War followed in 2003. The Bush administration justified it, among other things, with Saddam Hussein's alleged weapons of mass destruction and links to terrorism. These justifications later proved to be highly problematic, because the alleged weapons of mass destruction were not found. The war plunged Iraq into years of violence, cost many lives, and damaged the international reputation of the USA. Domestically, the attacks also led to new security laws, stronger surveillance, and debates about the relationship between freedom and security. In 2008, the USA was plunged into the worst financial and economic crisis since the Great Depression. A real estate bubble, risky financial products, and weak regulation led to the collapse of large banks and a global crisis. Millions of people lost homes, jobs, or savings. In this situation, Barack Obama was elected president. His election was historic, as he was the first African American president of the United States. For many people, it symbolized progress and hope, especially against the backdrop of the long history of slavery, segregation, and civil rights struggles. Obama tried to stabilize the economy and push through reforms. His best-known domestic policy project was the Affordable Care Act, often called Obamacare, which was intended to give more people access to health insurance. The reform was an important step, but remained politically highly controversial. Obama's presidency also showed that progress and backlash often occur simultaneously. While his election was a sign of social openness for many, political polarization, racist resentment, and distrust of state institutions intensified. In 2016, Donald Trump was elected president. His election showed how great the dissatisfaction had become in parts of the population. Trump promised to bring back jobs, tighten controls on immigration, renegotiate international agreements, and put America's interests first. His presidency was marked by conflicts with the media, courts, political opponents, and parts of his own administration. For his supporters, he was a fighter against elites and political correctness. For his critics, he was a danger to democratic norms and social cohesion. The 2020 presidential election led to another crisis. Joe Biden won the election, but Trump did not recognize the result and claimed without sufficient evidence that the election had been stolen. On January 6, 2021, Trump supporters stormed the Capitol in Washington while Congress confirmed the election results. This attack shook confidence in the stability of American democracy. He showed that political polarization not only meant conflict in debates, but could also turn into violence against democratic institutions. At the same time, the world was shaken by the COVID-19 pandemic from 2020 onwards. The USA was also severely affected. The pandemic exposed weaknesses in the health system, exacerbated social inequalities, and led to fierce political disputes over masks, vaccinations, school closures, and government measures. Millions of people lost relatives, jobs, or economic security. The pandemic reinforced the feeling that society was living in separate realities, in which even scientific questions were politically charged. In the 2020s, further conflicts came to the fore. The Black Lives Matter movement, especially after the killing of George Floyd in 2020, once again made police violence and structural racism a national issue. Millions of people demonstrated. Some called for police reforms, others for a fundamentally different distribution of public funds. Opponents accused the movement of endangering security and order. The debate showed that the questions from Reconstruction and the Civil Rights Movement were still not closed. The role of the Supreme Court also became increasingly controversial. Decisions on abortion, gun rights, religious freedom, environmental regulation, and state powers made it clear how strongly courts can influence the political direction of the country. In particular, the lifting of the nationwide constitutional protection of abortion in 2022 triggered strong reactions. The question of which rights apply nationwide and what individual states are allowed to determine themselves is reminiscent of old conflicts of American federalism in a new form. At the same time, the USA remains a country of enormous strength. They have one of the largest economies in the world, leading universities, powerful tech companies, an influential cultural industry, and large military capabilities. Hollywood, music, social media, software, artificial intelligence, and American consumer culture continue to shape people around the world. The population of the USA was estimated at around 341.8 million people as of July 2025, making the country one of the most populous countries in the world. But the challenges are great. Economic inequality, high healthcare costs, migration, climate change, gun violence, racism, political radicalization, and distrust of institutions characterize the present. Polls show that economic concerns, immigration, and healthcare are among the most important issues that many Americans want their government to solve. Concern about the political system itself is also strong. At the beginning of 2026, AP reported exceptionally high political fears among the American population. After Biden's term in office, Donald Trump returned to the White House after the 2024 election and has been the 47th president of the United States since 2025. His return shows how deep the country's political divisions have become. For some, it represents a correction of previous policies and a strengthening of national interests. For others, it represents a continuation of the crisis of democratic norms. The U.S. thus continues to be in an intense dispute over what freedom, democracy, national identity, and justice should mean in the 21st century. If you look back at the entire history of the USA, a pattern becomes visible. The country has always been shaped by great ideals, but also by deep contradictions. Freedom existed alongside slavery. Democracy existed alongside exclusion. Prosperity existed alongside poverty. Progress existed alongside violence and repression. It is precisely this tension that makes American history so important and so contested. To this day, the USA is a country that fascinates and polarizes. They spread democratic ideas, but also dominated foreign countries. They have opened up opportunities for immigrants, but they have also excluded people. They have brought about technological and cultural revolutions, but they are struggling with social divisions. Her story is therefore not a simple success story or a pure story of failure. It is the story of a country that has repeatedly tried to keep its own promises, and has often failed because of its own contradictions. In the end, the central question remains: what does America mean? Is it a place, a constitution, an idea, a dream, or a conflict? Maybe it's all of these things at the same time. The history of the USA shows that nations do not emerge ready-made. They are constantly being renegotiated through struggles, reforms, protests, elections, crises, and hopes. That is precisely why the history of the United States is not only in the past. It is still open today.